The ones who love you most can break you the fastest. Think about the worst pain you have ever felt. Not the physical kind. The kind that sits in your chest and does not move for weeks. Now think about who caused it. If you are being completely honest with yourself, it probably was not a stranger. It was not some random person on the street who looked at you wrong. It was someone who knew your name, knew your history, knew exactly what you needed to hear when you were falling apart. And that is what makes this truth so uncomfortable. The people who are capable of loving you the most are the exact same people who are capable of destroying you the most. This is not a coincidence. This is psychology working exactly the way it was designed to. Here is what most people get wrong about emotional pain. They think intensity of pain equals malicious intent. As in, if someone hurt you that badly, they must have wanted to. But that is not how it works. The reason the people closest to you can shatter you in ways that strangers simply cannot is because of something called attachment theory. When we form deep emotional bonds with someone, our nervous system literally begins to regulate itself around that person. Your sense of safety, your sense of worth, your baseline mood, all of it starts to get wired into the presence of that individual. They become what psychologists call a safe haven. And when a safe haven becomes a source of threat, the psychological damage is unlike anything else a human being can experience. John Bowlby, the psychologist who developed attachment theory, found that our earliest bonds teach us how to expect to be treated and how to feel about ourselves in relation to other people. When those bonds are secure, we grow up with a kind of internal armor. When they are disrupted or weaponized, even unintentionally, they leave a wound that runs deeper than most people want to admit. And here is the darker layer that nobody talks about. Because you love someone, you give them access. You let them see the version of you that you hide from the rest of the world. The insecurities, the fears, the moments where you are not holding it together. That level of exposure is an act of profound trust. But it also means that when something goes wrong, when there is a betrayal or an abandonment, or even just a careless word spoken at the wrong moment, they are not hitting you in an armored place. They are hitting you exactly where you are completely unprotected. That is why a dismissive comment from a stranger does nothing, but the same comment from someone you love can replay in your head for years. That is why you can brush off rejection from someone you barely know but feel genuinely destroyed when someone who claimed to love you walks away. The emotional access they have to you is not equal to the emotional access you give everyone. It is magnified. It is specific. And it cuts through every defense you have built. There is also something called the intimacy paradox that makes this even more complicated. The closer we get to someone, the more we begin to expect from them. Not because we are being unreasonable, but because closeness creates legitimate emotional investment. You have restructured your life, your thoughts, maybe even your identity around this person. And so when they fail to meet the expectations that come with that level of closeness, the disappointment is not just disappointment. It feels like a fundamental rupture in reality, like something that was supposed to be true has been proven false. And the cruelest part is that none of this requires bad intentions to cause enormous damage. Some of the deepest wounds come from people who genuinely loved you, but did not know how to love you well. Parents who gave you everything material, but never once asked how you actually felt. Partners who stayed but made you feel invisible. friends who were loyal in the broad strokes but devastating in the small moments. The love was real. The damage was also real. Both can be true at the same time, and that is one of the most disorienting things a person can sit with. This is not about blame. It is about understanding the mechanism. Because once you understand that closeness is what creates the vulnerability, not weakness on your part, it changes how you see yourself in relation to your past. It means you were not broken for being hurt. You were human. The pain was proportional to the love, not proportional to your fragility. That is the truth most people are not ready to accept, but cannot stop needing to hear. Every time you remember something, your brain rewrites it. Your memory is not a recording. It never was. Every single time you pull up a memory, whether it is something that happened last week or something that happened 20 years ago, your brain does not simply play it back the way a video file would. It reconstructs it. It rebuilds it piece by piece using whatever emotional state you are in right now, whatever new information you have collected since then, and whatever story you have been unconsciously telling yourself about who you are and what your life means. And every time it does that, it saves a slightly different version over the original. The original is gone. What you are left with is a copy of a copy of a copy, each one quietly shaped by the person you have become since the moment it happened. This is not a glitch. This is how human memory was built to work, but it has consequences that most people are completely unprepared to face. The neuroscience behind this is called memory reconsolidation. When a memory is stored in the brain, it does not sit in some fixed, protected location waiting to be accessed. Every time you retrieve it, the memory becomes temporarily unstable, almost like a document that has been opened for editing. During that window, it is vulnerable to change. New emotions can attach to it. New context can alter the meaning of it. Details can shift, sharpen, or disappear entirely, and then the brain saves it again in its updated form. Researchers at New York University confirmed this process in studies, showing that the act of remembering is itself an act of alteration. You are not just recalling the past, you are actively remaking it every time you visit it. Now here is where it gets genuinely unsettling. Think about a painful memory you have revisited many times. Maybe a conversation that went badly, a moment you felt humiliated, a relationship that ended in a way that still does not make complete sense to you. Every time you have gone back to that memory and replayed it, you have changed it. The version you are carrying right now is not what actually happened. It is a composite built from every emotional state you were in each time you thought about it, every new piece of information you layered onto it, every conclusion you eventually drew about yourself or the other person involved. The memory feels real and vivid and completely accurate, but it is the product of dozens of unconscious edits made over years. This is why two people can walk out of the exact same conversation and remember fundamentally different things. Neither of them is lying. Neither of them is even wrong in any simple sense. They are both reporting the version their brain has been quietly constructing and reconstructing since it happened. And the more emotionally significant the event, the more it gets revisited, and the more it gets rewritten. Elizabeth Loftus, one of the most important memory researchers in modern psychology, spent her career demonstrating just how malleable human memory really is. In her studies, she was able to implant entirely false memories into people by simply suggesting things that never happened, not vague impressions. Detailed, confident, emotionally felt memories of events that were completely fabricated. People would recall these invented experiences with the same certainty they recalled real ones. That is not a flaw in her subjects. That is the baseline architecture of the human mind. What this means for how you understand your own life is deeply uncomfortable. The story you tell yourself about your childhood, about your worst moments, about the people who hurt you or the ones you hurt, that story is not a document of what happened. It is a living, shifting construction that has been reshaped every time grief or anger or nostalgia or new understanding sent you back into it. You are not remembering your past. You are authoring it over and over without realizing you have the pen in your hand. That does not make your experiences less real. It does not mean your pain is invalid or your joy was imagined. But it does mean that the version of events you have been defending, the one you have organized your identity around, may have less to do with what actually happened and more to do with who you were each time you remembered it. That is not a comfortable thought, but it might be one of the most important ones you ever sit with. Most people fear their own thoughts more than pain. Silence used to be something people sought. Quiet was rest. Stillness was a luxury. But somewhere along the way that changed, and if you pay attention to how people actually behave when they are left alone with nothing to do, you start to notice something that is difficult to explain away. People will choose discomfort over stillness. They will choose noise over quiet. They will reach for their phone before the boredom even has a chance to fully arrive. And the more you look at this pattern, the clearer it becomes that what people are running from is not the absence of stimulation. It is the presence of their own mind. In 2014, a team of psychologists at the University of Virginia ran a study that should have been straightforward. Participants were asked to sit alone in a room for somewhere between 6 and 15 minutes with nothing to do except think. No phone, no book, no music. Just their own thoughts. That was the entire task. What happened next was genuinely bizarre. A significant number of participants, when given the option, chose to administer electric shocks to themselves rather than continue sitting quietly with their own minds. These were shocks they had previously rated as unpleasant. They had already said they would pay money to avoid experiencing them again. And yet, when the alternative was uninterrupted silence and their own thoughts, they chose the pain. One participant shocked himself 190 times in 15 minutes. Let that land for a moment. Physical pain, deliberately chosen, was preferable to being alone with their own thinking. This is not a quirk of that particular study. It reflects something much older and much deeper about how the human mind relates to itself. The brain is not a neutral observer of your life. It is an active, relentless generator. It produces thoughts constantly, and a meaningful portion of those thoughts are ones you did not ask for and do not want. Intrusive thoughts, self-critical loops, unresolved fears, grief that surfaces without warning, anxieties that have no clean solution. The mind left without external input does not go quiet. It goes loud. And for a lot of people, what comes up in that loudness is material they have spent enormous energy avoiding. Psychologists call the attempt to suppress unwanted thoughts ironic process theory, and the name tells you everything. The harder you try not to think about something, the more persistently it shows up. Daniel Wegner demonstrated this in the white bear experiment, where people asked to suppress thoughts of a white bear actually thought about it more than people who were given no instructions at all. The suppression creates a monitoring process in the brain that keeps checking whether the forbidden thought has returned, and in checking, it keeps bringing the thought back. You cannot think your way out of thinking. And most people, on some level, know this. So instead of engaging with what is in there, they opt out of the inner world entirely. The tragedy is what gets lost in that avoidance. When you are never alone with your thoughts, you never process them. The emotions that did not get examined do not disappear just because you stayed busy enough to ignore them. They accumulate. They find other ways out, usually through behavior, through mood, through reactions that feel disproportionate to the moment, because they are carrying the weight of everything that never got properly dealt with. The person who cannot sit quietly is not someone who has nothing going on inside. They are often someone who has far too much going on inside and no practice in facing it. There is also something worth naming about what this costs people over time in terms of self-knowledge. Understanding who you actually are requires spending time with your own mind. Your values, your honest reactions, your real desires underneath the ones you perform for other people. None of that becomes clear through noise. It becomes clear through stillness. But if stillness is the one place you refuse to go, you end up living a life that is shaped more by distraction than by genuine self-awareness. You make decisions based on reflex. You build habits based on avoidance. You relate to other people through a version of yourself you have never actually examined. The fear of your own thoughts is not irrational. Some of what lives in the quiet is genuinely hard. Unprocessed grief is hard. Honest self-assessment is hard. The recognition that certain things in your life are not working is hard. But the alternative, which is a permanent, frantic flight from your own inner experience, costs more in the long run than whatever it was you were trying to avoid ever could. The mind you are afraid to sit with is still your mind. It is still you. And the things you are most afraid to think about are almost always the things that most need your attention. The discomfort of looking inward is temporary. What builds up when you refuse to look is not. Your decision is made before you think you have made it. There is a moment you probably recognize. You are weighing something up. Maybe it is a big life choice, maybe it is something smaller, but you are sitting with it, turning it over, considering your options, and then, at some point, a conclusion arrives, and you call it a decision. You feel like you just made it. You feel like the thinking you just did produced the outcome. That is the story the conscious mind tells itself constantly, and it is one of the most convincing illusions the human brain has ever constructed. Because the neuroscience is now clear enough to be genuinely destabilizing. By the time you are aware of making a choice, the choice has already been made. You are not the author of your decisions in the way you think you are. You are closer to the narrator, reading aloud something that was written before you even knew the story had started. In the late 1970s and early 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet ran a series of experiments that shook the foundations of how scientists and philosophers thought about free will. He asked participants to flex their wrist whenever they felt like it while watching a clock, and to note the exact moment they became aware of the intention to move. At the same time he was recording their brain activity. What he found was that the brain showed a detectable signal called the readiness potential, a measurable buildup of electrical activity, an average of half a second before the participant reported any conscious intention to move. The brain had already initiated the action before the person was aware of deciding to take it. The decision was not made in the moment of awareness. The awareness came after the decision had already been set in motion. Half a second might not sound like much, but in the context of what we believe about human consciousness and free will, it is enormous. It means there is a gap between when your brain commits to something and when you consciously experience yourself as choosing. And that gap is not the exception. It is the rule. It happens every time. Later research expanded this dramatically. In 2008, scientists using brain imaging technology were able to predict which button a participant would press up to 10 seconds before the participant reported making the decision. 10 seconds, an entire decade of moments before you feel yourself choosing, the outcome is already encoded in your neural activity. The conscious experience of deciding, that familiar sense of deliberation and resolution, is something your brain constructs after the fact and presents to you, as though it were the cause rather than the consequence. This is where the implications start to feel genuinely heavy, because if your decisions are being generated below the level of conscious awareness, then the question of who is actually running your life becomes a lot more complicated. The preferences, the biases, the emotional patterns, the deep assumptions you carry about yourself and the world around you, all of that is operating underneath the surface, shaping outcomes before your conscious mind gets anywhere near them. What you think of as rational deliberation is very often a post hoc justification. Your brain decided, and then it handed you a reason that feels like it caused the decision, because a mind that understands its own choices is far more comfortable to live inside than one that does not. Psychologists call this confabulation. It is the process by which the brain generates explanations for behavior that it did not consciously control. It is not lying in the way we typically mean. It is something stranger than that. It is the mind filling in a story of agency and logic around actions that were already determined by processes it has no direct access to. And people do this constantly, automatically, and with complete confidence that the story they are telling is accurate. Now here is the part that most people want to argue with. Does this mean free will does not exist? That question is genuinely unresolved, and it is not the most useful place to put your attention. What is useful is this: if the architecture beneath your conscious mind is what is actually driving your choices, then the most powerful thing you can do is not to think harder in the moment of deciding. It is to examine what is shaping the architecture itself. Your values, your fears, your unresolved history, the beliefs you absorbed before you were old enough to question them. Those are what your unconscious is drawing on when it makes your decisions for you before you know it is doing so. You have more influence over your choices than the neuroscience might initially suggest. But that influence does not live in the moment of deciding. It lives in everything you do before you ever arrive there. The decision you think you are making right now was built long before this moment. The only real question is whether you have ever paid attention to what built it. What irritates you in others exists somewhere in you. Nobody likes to hear this one. And the resistance people feel when they first encounter it is actually part of the proof that it is true. Think about the last time someone genuinely got under your skin. Not mild annoyance, but the kind of irritation that feels almost personal. The kind where you catch yourself replaying what they did or said and feeling the heat of it all over again. Now ask yourself something honest. Why that person? Why that specific behavior? because you are surrounded by imperfect people doing imperfect things constantly, and most of it slides right past you without leaving a mark. But every now and then something sticks, and it does not just stick, it burns. And the reason it burns that particular way, with that particular intensity, almost never has as much to do with the other person as you would like to believe. Carl Jung called this the shadow. It is one of the most important and least comfortable ideas in all of psychology. The shadow is the part of yourself you have rejected, buried, or refused to acknowledge. It is made up of the traits, impulses, and tendencies that you decided at some point were unacceptable, either because someone told you they were, or because you told yourself they were, or because expressing them felt too dangerous in the environment you grew up in. So you pushed them down. You built an identity that excluded them. You became, in your own mind, someone who does not have those qualities. And then you walked out into the world and started meeting people who do. And something in you could not stand it. This is what projection looks like in its most everyday form. When a quality lives in you but you have disowned it, encountering it in someone else does not feel neutral. It feels threatening. It feels wrong in a way that is hard to articulate but impossible to ignore. Because on some level the other person is showing you something you have worked very hard not to see in yourself. The irritation is not really about them. It is about the discomfort of recognition. Your unconscious knows what your conscious mind is refusing to look at, and it signals that recognition through the heat of judgment. The research that supports this is extensive. A 2019 study published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that people who scored high on traits like narcissism or disagreeableness were significantly more likely to attribute those same traits to others, and significantly more reactive when they observed those behaviors in social situations. The very qualities they possessed most strongly were the ones they were quickest to condemn when they saw them elsewhere. The disowning of a trait does not make it disappear. It just makes you extraordinarily sensitive to its presence in the world around you. And here is what makes this particularly worth sitting with. The things that irritate you about other people tend to fall into two categories, though they feel identical from the inside. The first is someone behaving in a way you have suppressed in yourself. The person who is loud and unfiltered when you have spent years learning to be contained and careful. The person who asks for what they want without apology when you have been taught that desire is something to be hidden. The person who sets boundaries firmly when you have been conditioned to accommodate everyone. You do not just find them annoying. You find them almost offensive. And underneath that offense is a desire you have never allowed yourself to act on. The second category is watching someone do something you actually do yourself, but cannot see clearly. This one is harder to accept. The person whose constant need for validation exhausts you, when you yourself have been quietly seeking approval in every room you have ever entered. The person whose tendency to avoid difficult conversations frustrates you, when your own drawers are full of things you have never said. The anger at them is real, but it is borrowed anger, displaced from somewhere closer to home. Jung believed that integrating the shadow, actually looking at what you have pushed down and acknowledging it as part of yourself, was one of the most important psychological tasks a human being could undertake. Not because it is comfortable, but because the alternative is spending your life in a state of unconscious conflict, burning energy on judgment that is really self, judgment wearing someone else as a mask. This does not mean every irritation is a mirror. Some people are genuinely difficult in ways that have nothing to do with your inner world. But the ones that get under your skin and stay there, the ones that feel almost personal even when they should not, those are worth examining. Not with shame, but with the kind of honest curiosity that asks, what exactly is it about this that I cannot let go of? And what does that say about something I have not yet been willing to face in myself? The answer will not always be comfortable, but it will almost always be accurate. Loneliness kills as reliably as heavy smoking. We have spent decades building an entire public health infrastructure around the dangers of smoking. Warning labels, advertising bans, tax increases, cultural stigma, all of it designed to make people viscerally aware that this habit is shortening their life. And it worked, at least partially. Most people today understand that smoking kills. What almost nobody talks about with the same urgency, the same policy attention, or the same cultural alarm is something that research now shows is comparably lethal. Not metaphorically, not as a figure of speech. Comparably lethal in measurable, biological, undeniable terms. And unlike smoking, it is something that millions of people are experiencing right now without any warning label, without any public acknowledgement that what they are living through is not just emotionally painful, but physically dangerous. That thing is loneliness. In 2015, researcher Julianne Holt Lundstad published a meta-analysis that pulled together data from over 140 studies involving more than 3 million people across multiple countries. The finding was unambiguous. Social isolation and loneliness increased the risk of premature death by approximately 26%. Holt-Lundstad compared this directly to the mortality risk of smoking 15 cigarettes a day, not a pack. 15 cigarettes, and loneliness came out equivalent. In some measures it came out worse. The effect held across age groups, across cultures, across different definitions of social connection, and across different causes of death. This was not a single study with a provocative headline. It was one of the largest and most rigorous examinations of human social connection ever conducted, and its conclusion was that the absence of meaningful connection kills people at a rate that our society has almost entirely failed to treat as a public health emergency. Now here is the part that most people do not understand about why this happens biologically. Loneliness is not just an emotion. It is a threat signal. When the human brain perceives social isolation, it activates the same neural pathways as physical pain and perceived danger. From an evolutionary standpoint, this makes complete sense. For most of human history, being separated from your group meant you were exposed, vulnerable, and likely to die. So the brain developed a sophisticated alarm system to make isolation feel genuinely unbearable, not to punish you, but to motivate you to reconnect before the isolation became fatal. The problem is that alarm system was designed for a world that no longer exists. In modern life, people can be chronically isolated in ways that have nothing to do with physical separation and everything to do with the quality and depth of their human contact. What the research consistently shows is that it is not the number of people around you that determines whether you are lonely. It is whether you feel genuinely known and understood by any of them. A person can live alone and feel deeply connected. A person can be married, employed, and surrounded by acquaintances and feel a loneliness so complete it registers in their body as chronic stress. And that chronic stress is where the killing starts. Long-term loneliness elevates cortisol levels, disrupts sleep, increases inflammation, suppresses immune function, raises blood pressure, and accelerates the progression of cardiovascular disease. The body is not designed to sustain the alarm signal of isolation indefinitely. When it is forced to, the physiological cost accumulates in ways that show up years later in the form of illness and shortened life. There is also a cognitive dimension that makes this harder to escape once it sets in. Loneliness changes how the brain processes social information. Research led by John Cacioppo at the University of Chicago found that lonely people become hypervigilant to social threat. They start reading neutral interactions as hostile. They interpret ambiguous social signals as rejection. They become more defensive, more withdrawn, and paradoxically, harder to connect with, not because they want to be, but because the brain has shifted into a protective mode that makes genuine openness feel dangerous. Loneliness produces the very behaviors that deepen it. It becomes self-reinforcing in a way that can be almost impossible to interrupt without understanding the mechanism. This is worth naming clearly because the cultural conversation around loneliness still treats it almost entirely as a personal failing or a lifestyle choice. The person who is lonely is assumed to be introverted or socially unskilled or not trying hard enough. The reality is that loneliness is a biological state with biological consequences, driven by factors that extend far beyond individual effort and rooted in social structures that have been systematically dismantling the conditions for genuine human connection for decades. The loneliness epidemic is not a metaphor. It is a measurable, ongoing, largely unaddressed public health crisis that is shortening lives at a scale that dwarfs many of the conditions we pour billions of dollars into treating. And the most dangerous part is that it is invisible. It leaves no mark on the body that a scan can detect. It generates no warning label. It asks for nothing. It just quietly does its work year after year in the bodies of people who have been told their whole lives that needing other people is a weakness rather than a biological necessity. You become a different person in a different language. If you speak more than one language, you already know this on some level, even if you have never put it into words. There is a version of you that exists in your first language, and a version of you that exists in the other one, and they are not identical. The way you joke is different. The way you argue is different. The way you express affection, handle conflict, or describe your own feelings shifts, depending on which linguistic world you are operating in. Most bilingual people notice this and chalk it up to cultural context, to the fact that different languages come with different social settings. But the research suggests something considerably deeper than that. It is not just that you behave differently in a different language. It is that you think differently, feel differently, and in measurable psychological terms, you actually are a somewhat different person. This is not a poetic observation. It is a finding that has been replicated across multiple studies using personality assessments, emotional response testing, and moral reasoning tasks administered to the same individuals in different languages. In a widely cited study, researchers gave bilingual Spanish and English speakers a personality test in both languages on separate occasions. The results were not identical. When tested in Spanish, participants scored higher on agreeableness and conscientiousness. When tested in English, different dimensions of personality shifted in measurable ways. The same person, the same questions, different language, different self. The explanation for this goes deeper than social context, though social context is part of it. Language is not simply a vehicle for thought. It is part of the structure of thought itself. The concepts that exist in a language, the ones that have dedicated words and therefore dedicated cognitive pathways, shape what you are able to perceive, categorize, and feel in any given moment. There is a Japanese word, ama, that describes the particular comfort of depending on someone else and knowing that dependence is welcomed. There is no clean English equivalent, and the research suggests that people who have that word available to them not only describe that feeling more easily, they access and recognize it more readily because the language has carved a specific groove in their cognition for it to travel through. When a concept has no word, it does not vanish from experience entirely, but it becomes harder to identify, harder to communicate, and in practical terms, less available to conscious thought. This is part of what linguistic relativity, sometimes called the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, has been exploring for nearly a century. The stronger version of the theory, that language completely determines thought, has been largely set aside, but the weaker version, that language significantly shapes perception, emotional access, and cognitive framing, has accumulated enough empirical support that it is now considered mainstream rather than fringe. The language you think in is not neutral. It is a lens that emphasizes certain things and obscures others, and switching languages means switching lenses. The emotional dimension of this is where it becomes genuinely strange. Research by linguist June Mark Duwale found that bilinguals consistently rate emotional words in their first language as feeling more intense, more viscerally real than the same words in a second language. Profanity hits harder in the mother tongue. Terms of endearment feel warmer. Words associated with childhood, family, or early emotional experience carry more weight in the language in which those experiences were first processed. This means that a person who conducts a difficult conversation in their second language is not just using different words. They are operating with a degree of emotional distance that genuinely affects how they experience the exchange. Some therapists who work with multilingual clients report that patients will spontaneously switch to their second language when discussing material that feels too raw in their first, using the mild dissociation of a less emotionally saturated language as an unconscious buffer against the full force of what they are processing. The moral dimension is equally striking. A series of studies by Albert Costa at the University of Barcelona found that people reasoning through ethical dilemmas in a foreign language made more utilitarian decisions, choices that maximized outcomes at the expense of emotional discomfort, than when they reasoned through the same dilemmas in their native tongue. The foreign language created enough cognitive and emotional distance to allow the analytical mind to override the gut reaction. Who you are when you make your hardest decisions depends, in part, on which language you are making them in. What this ultimately means is that identity is not as fixed or singular as most people assume. The self is not one stable thing that simply expresses itself through whatever language happens to be available. It is something that gets constructed and reconstructed through language, shaped by the specific concepts, emotional textures, and cognitive structures that each linguistic system makes available. You are not translated when you switch languages. You are, in some real and measurable sense, transformed. The question worth sitting with is which version of yourself knows you best, and whether the language you live most of your life in is giving you full access to the person you actually are. Your mind invents reasons to justify feelings it already has. Have you ever noticed how two people can go through the exact same situation and walk away with completely different explanations of what happened? One person says it was disrespect. The other says it was just a misunderstanding. One person believes they were betrayed. The other thinks nothing was wrong at all. Most people assume the difference comes from logic. They think people gather facts first and then form feelings. But the uncomfortable truth is that the process often works in reverse. Your mind does not always look at reality and create an emotion. Many times, it feels something first and then creates a story that makes the feelings seem reasonable. That means some of the explanations you trust most are not actually discoveries. They are justifications. Think about how often someone says they dislike a person because they are arrogant, annoying, or fake. Sounds logical, sounds rational. But what if the dislike came first? What if something about that person triggered insecurity, jealousy, competition, or even a vague sense of discomfort that could not be explained in words? The brain hates uncertainty. It hates having emotions without reasons. So it gets to work. It searches for evidence. It builds a case. It becomes a lawyer defending a verdict that was already decided. And the scary part is that it feels completely true. Psychologists have spent decades studying this phenomenon. The human brain is not a neutral observer. It is a storyteller. When emotions appear, the mind often rushes to explain them. Not necessarily with the truth, but with a story that feels convincing enough to protect your sense of certainty. Imagine meeting someone at a party. Within seconds, you get a strange feeling about them. Maybe you cannot explain it. Maybe nothing is objectively wrong, but the feeling is there. Now watch what happens next. Suddenly, every small thing they do becomes evidence. The way they speak, the way they laugh, the way they stand. Your brain starts collecting details that support the feeling you already had. Meanwhile, if you liked them from the beginning, those exact same behaviors might seem charming. Same person, same actions, different emotional starting point, different story. This is one reason why people can be so confident and still be completely wrong. Confidence does not always come from accuracy. Sometimes it comes from how convincing the story is inside your own head. And this does not just happen with other people. It happens with relationships, careers, beliefs, and major life decisions. Someone leaves a job and spends months explaining all the reasons it was the right choice. The toxic environment, the lack of opportunity, the bad management. Some of those reasons may be true, but often the emotional decision happened first. They felt unhappy. They felt restless. They felt trapped. Then the mind built a logical framework around those feelings. The same thing happens in relationships. A person falls out of love and suddenly starts noticing every flaw. Habits that once seemed adorable become irritating. Quirks become problems. Small mistakes become proof that the relationship was doomed all along. But if the emotional connection returns, many of those same flaws magically become acceptable again. The facts did not change. The feelings did. And the mind adjusted the story to match. Researchers studying decision-making discovered something fascinating. When people make choices, the emotional parts of the brain often become active before the conscious reasoning parts begin explaining the decision. In simple terms, your brain frequently decides first and explains later. That realization should make everyone a little uncomfortable, because it raises a disturbing question. How many of your strongest opinions are actually conclusions, and how many are explanations created after an emotional reaction. Think about arguments. Most people believe they are exchanging facts. In reality, many arguments are two people defending emotional positions that were formed long before the conversation started. Each side gathers evidence. Each side feels logical. Each side believes they are following reason. But beneath the surface, emotions are often driving the entire process. This is why changing someone's mind is so difficult. You can attack the argument, but the argument is usually not the real source. The source is the feeling underneath it: fear, pride, resentment, hope, insecurity. Those emotions silently shape what evidence gets accepted and what evidence gets rejected. And here is where this truth becomes personal. Have you ever convinced yourself you wanted something, only to realize later that you wanted the feeling attached to it? The promotion was not really about the job. It was about validation. The expensive purchase was not really about the object. It was about status. The argument was not really about being right. It was about feeling respected. The brain is incredibly skilled at disguising emotional needs as logical goals. That is why self-awareness is so rare. Most people examine their thoughts. Very few examine the feelings that created those thoughts. And those hidden feelings can quietly control entire lives. Someone spends years chasing success because they believe they are ambitious, never realizing they are actually trying to escape feelings of inadequacy. Someone stays in a relationship because they think they are loyal, never realizing they are terrified of being alone. Someone hates another person because they think that person is terrible, never realizing they see qualities they secretly envy. The conscious explanation sounds noble. The emotional reality is often much darker. None of this means logic is useless. It means logic is not always in charge. Your mind is constantly working behind the scenes, taking emotional impulses and dressing them up in rational clothing. It wants your internal world to make sense. It wants a coherent story. It wants certainty. So whenever a strong feeling appears, the brain starts writing a narrative. The danger is not that the narrative exists. The danger is believing the narrative without questioning where it came from. Because sometimes the reason you think you feel something is not the real reason at all. And once you realize how often your mind explains emotions after the fact, you start looking at your own certainty differently. You begin to wonder whether the story is actually true, or whether it is simply the most convincing excuse your mind could invent. Anonymity turns ordinary people into strangers to themselves. There is a version of you that exists only when nobody knows who you are. Not your family, not your friends, not your coworkers, not the people who follow you online. A version that emerges the moment consequences disappear and your identity becomes invisible. Most people like to believe they know themselves. They think character is fixed. They think morality is stable. They think the person they are in public is the same person they would be anywhere else. But anonymity has a way of exposing something far more unsettling. It can transform ordinary people into strangers to themselves. Think about how differently people behave when they know they are being watched. Their words become more careful. Their actions become more controlled. They think about reputation, judgment, and consequences. There is an invisible pressure that keeps behavior within certain boundaries. Now remove that pressure. Remove the name. Remove the face. Remove the accountability. Something changes. Suddenly people say things they would never say in person. They insult strangers. They spread cruelty. They celebrate failures. They enjoy humiliating others. Sometimes they become versions of themselves that even they would not recognize in everyday life. And what makes this so disturbing is that these are not usually criminals or monsters. They are ordinary people, people who smile at neighbors, people who help friends, people who consider themselves kind. Yet when anonymity enters the picture, a completely different side can emerge. Psychologists have studied this effect for decades. One of the most powerful explanations comes from a phenomenon known as de-individuation. When people feel anonymous, their sense of personal identity weakens. The normal awareness of being an individual with responsibility and consequences begins to fade. Instead of asking, "What kind of person am I?" the mind starts asking, "What can I get away with?" That shift changes everything, because self-awareness acts like an internal mirror. When that mirror becomes blurry, behavior often changes with it. Imagine walking through a city where nobody knows your name and nobody will ever see you again. The choices available to you suddenly feel different. Rules that once felt automatic become optional. Thoughts that were once suppressed become tempting. Most people assume character is revealed when life becomes difficult. But sometimes character is revealed when nobody is watching, and the answer is not always comforting. History provides countless examples of this. Large crowds, masked groups, anonymous online communities. Again and again, researchers have observed the same pattern. Individuals who would never act aggressively alone can become shockingly hostile when their identity disappears into a group. It is almost as if anonymity grants permission. Permission to ignore empathy. Permission to silence guilt. Permission to release impulses that normally stay hidden. The internet has become one of the clearest demonstrations of this truth. A person spends the day acting polite and respectful. Then they go online behind a screen name and become vicious. They attack strangers. They mock vulnerabilities. They say things designed purely to hurt. If you met them face to face, you might never suspect it. That is because anonymity does not just hide people from others. Sometimes it hides people from themselves. The person typing those words may genuinely believe they are a good person. They may still see themselves that way afterward. The brain is remarkably skilled at separating actions from identity when consequences are removed. It creates excuses. Everyone else is doing it. It is just a joke. Nobody got hurt. They deserved it. The behavior changes, but the self-image remains protected. That is what makes anonymity so psychologically powerful. It allows people to act without immediately confronting what those actions say about them. But there is another side to this story that few people talk about. Anonymity does not only reveal darkness, sometimes it reveals truth. There are people who become kinder when nobody knows who they are. They donate anonymously. They help strangers without seeking credit. They offer support without expecting recognition. They do good things specifically because no reward is attached. In those moments, anonymity removes ego rather than accountability, and that creates an uncomfortable question. When nobody is watching, who are you really? The answer is rarely simple. Human beings are not made of one personality. We carry different impulses, different desires, different capacities within us. Some are generous. Some are selfish. Some are compassionate. Some are cruel. Social expectations keep many of these forces balanced. But anonymity loosens the restraints. It creates space for hidden parts of the personality to step forward. That is why people are often shocked by their own behavior after the fact. They look back and think, "I cannot believe I said that. I cannot believe I did that." But they did. Not because anonymity created something entirely new, because it revealed something that was already there, a possibility, a temptation, a side of themselves they rarely had the opportunity to see. The frightening reality is that most people do not truly know the boundaries of their character. They know who they are under observation. They know who they are when consequences exist. They know who they are when reputation is on the line. But remove all of that, and the results become unpredictable. That is why anonymity is such a powerful psychological test. It strips away external pressure and forces a confrontation with internal reality. Not the version of yourself crafted for public display. Not the version shaped by approval. Not the version maintained by fear of judgment. The version that emerges when no one is keeping score. And sometimes that version is so different from the person people think they are that it feels like meeting a complete stranger. The darkest part is not that anonymity changes people. The darkest part is that it often reveals how much of who we think we are depends on being seen. You prefer things not because they're good, but because they're familiar. Think about the last time you defended something in your life that was clearly not making you happy. Maybe it was a relationship that drained you. Maybe it was a job you hated waking up for every morning. Maybe it was a habit you knew was holding you back. Yet somehow, despite all the evidence, you kept choosing it. Most people assume they make choices based on quality. They believe they are attracted to things because those things are good, useful, or beneficial. But the truth is much darker. Human beings often prefer things simply because they are familiar, not because they are healthy, not because they are right, not because they are helping, just because they are known. And once you understand this, an enormous amount of human behavior suddenly starts making sense. We like to think of ourselves as rational. We imagine that we carefully weigh options and make decisions based on logic. But much of the time, the brain is following a different rule entirely. Familiarity feels safe. The mind does not always chase happiness. It chases predictability, even if that predictability comes with pain. Imagine someone who grew up in a home filled with constant criticism. Every mistake was pointed out. Every success was minimized. Every day felt like an attempt to earn approval that never fully arrived. Years later, that person may find themselves attracted to partners who treat them in remarkably similar ways. From the outside, it looks absurd. Why would someone willingly choose that? Because the emotional pattern feels familiar. Their nervous system recognizes it. Their brain understands it. Their subconscious knows how to survive in it. A healthier relationship might actually feel uncomfortable at first. Not because it is worse, because it is different. And different often feels dangerous. This is one of the most disturbing truths about human psychology. We frequently mistake familiarity for compatibility. We assume something feels right because it is right, when in reality, it often feels right because we have experienced it before. The brain is constantly trying to reduce uncertainty. Anything familiar requires less mental effort to understand, less energy, less risk. That is why researchers have repeatedly found that people tend to prefer things they have seen before, even when there is no logical reason to prefer them. Repeated exposure creates comfort. Comfort creates preference, and preference creates attachment. Before long, we start convincing ourselves that what is familiar must also be what is best. But those are completely different things. Look at how many people stay trapped in lives they secretly dislike, not for months, for years, sometimes for decades. They complain about their circumstances every day. They dream about change. They imagine better possibilities. Yet when the opportunity finally arrives, they hesitate. Some even run from it. Because uncertainty creates anxiety, and anxiety often feels more threatening than unhappiness. That sounds irrational until you realize how the brain works. The mind would often rather experience known pain than unknown possibility. Known pain has rules. Unknown possibility does not. That is why people return to relationships that already broke them. That is why people stay loyal to beliefs that no longer make sense. That is why people cling to identities that make them miserable. Familiarity creates an emotional gravity that pulls them back. And the longer something remains in your life, the stronger that pull becomes. But the most dangerous part is not what familiarity does to your choices. It is what it does to your perception. Over time, familiar things stop feeling strange. They stop standing out. They become normal. And once something feels normal, you stop questioning it. The unhealthy relationship becomes normal. The self-criticism becomes normal. The stress becomes normal. The loneliness becomes normal. The dissatisfaction becomes normal. The brain adapts to almost anything. That ability helps us survive. But it can also trap us in situations we should have escaped long ago. Because when something becomes familiar enough, it disappears into the background of everyday life. You no longer see it clearly. You simply accept it. And acceptance can be incredibly dangerous when the thing being accepted is harming you. What makes this even darker is that familiarity does not only shape external choices. It shapes how you see yourself. Many people become attached to their own suffering because suffering has become part of their identity. Someone who has spent years feeling inadequate may struggle to accept success. Someone who has always seen themselves as unlucky may reject opportunities that challenge that belief. Someone who believes they are unlovable may distrust genuine affection when it finally appears. Not because they enjoy suffering, because suffering feels familiar, and familiarity feels safe. The brain develops loyalty to patterns that have existed for a long time, even destructive ones, especially destructive ones, because those patterns helped create the version of reality the mind understands. Breaking free from them means stepping into uncertainty, and uncertainty is one of the things human beings fear most. This is why growth feels uncomfortable. Real growth requires leaving familiar territory. It requires questioning assumptions. It requires abandoning emotional habits that once felt like home. And the brain often interprets that process as danger. Not because you are moving towards something worse, because you are moving towards something unknown. Most people spend their lives believing they are making free choices. But how many of those choices are actually theirs? How many preferences are genuine preferences? How many are simply familiar patterns repeating themselves? How many relationships survive because of love? How many survive because they are predictable? How many beliefs remain because they are true? How many remain because they are comfortable? The uncomfortable reality is that familiarity has far more influence over your life than you probably realize. It quietly shapes what you trust, what you desire, what you tolerate, what you defend, and even who you become. The darkest part is that people can spend years protecting the very things that are limiting them. Not because those things are valuable, not because those things are healthy, but because they have become familiar. And once something feels familiar enough, the mind can mistake it for home, even when that home is the very thing keeping you trapped. Rejection and physical pain fire the same brain signals. A broken bone can be seen on an X-ray. A deep cut leaves a scar. A physical injury has evidence. People can point to it and say, yes, that pain is real. But what happens when the injury exists entirely inside your mind? What happens when no blood is spilled, no bones are broken, and yet the pain feels just as intense? Most people treat emotional pain as if it is somehow less real than physical pain. They tell themselves to get over it, to move on, to stop being dramatic. After all, nobody hit you, nobody physically harmed you. So why does rejection sometimes hurt so much that it feels impossible to think about anything else? The answer is both fascinating and deeply unsettling, because your brain often struggles to tell the difference. When researchers scanned the brains of people experiencing social rejection, they discovered something remarkable. Some of the same neural regions activated during physical pain also became active during emotional rejection. In other words, the brain processes a broken heart in a surprisingly similar way to a physical injury. Think about that for a second. The pain you feel after being excluded, abandoned, betrayed, ignored, or rejected is not just a metaphor. Your brain treats it as a genuine threat. That is why rejection can feel so overwhelming. It is not simply sadness. It is not merely disappointment. To your nervous system, something much more serious is happening. It feels like damage. And from an evolutionary perspective, that reaction makes perfect sense. Thousands of years ago, human survival depended on belonging to a group. Being accepted meant protection, resources, support, safety. Being rejected often meant isolation, and isolation could mean death. Your brain evolved in a world where social exclusion was not just emotionally painful, it was dangerous. So over time, the brain developed a powerful alarm system. Whenever rejection appeared, the alarm sounded. The problem is that the alarm still exists today. Only now it gets triggered by things that are not life-threatening at all. A text message left unanswered, a friend who suddenly becomes distant, a romantic partner who walks away, a job application that gets rejected, a room full of people who seem uninterested in you. The logical part of your mind understands that these experiences are survivable. But the deeper emotional systems inside your brain react as if something catastrophic has happened. That is why rejection can consume people. A person gets turned down once and spends weeks replaying the moment, analyzing every word, every expression, every detail, trying desperately to understand what went wrong. Not because they are weak, because their brain is treating the event like an injury that requires immediate attention. And just like physical wounds, emotional wounds demand focus. Imagine touching a hot stove. You would not simply forget about it 5 seconds later. Your attention would immediately shift toward the pain. Your brain would prioritize the injury. Emotional pain works in a remarkably similar way. The mind keeps returning to it, examining it, revisiting it, searching for answers, because the brain believes something important has been damaged. What makes rejection even more powerful is that it attacks something fundamental: your sense of belonging. Human beings have an almost desperate need to feel accepted, not admired, not celebrated, accepted. We want to know that we matter, that we are wanted, that we have a place. When rejection occurs, it threatens those needs all at once. And suddenly the pain becomes much larger than the actual event itself. A person is not just losing a relationship. They are questioning their worth. A person is not just being ignored. They are wondering whether they matter. A person is not just facing criticism. They are confronting the possibility that they are not enough. That is why rejection often hurts far more than people expect. The event is rarely the entire source of the pain. The meaning attached to it creates the deeper wound. And here is where things become even darker. The brain remembers social pain extremely well. In many cases, emotional wounds can linger longer than physical ones. A childhood insult, a humiliating moment at school, a betrayal from years ago, a rejection that happened decades earlier. People can still feel the sting long after the event itself has ended. The body healed, the situation passed, but the emotional memory remained. That is because the brain stores socially painful experiences as important survival information. It wants to make sure you avoid similar pain in the future. Unfortunately, that protection system often creates new problems. Someone who experiences rejection may become afraid to take risks, afraid to be vulnerable, afraid to trust, afraid to try again. The brain starts building defenses, and those defenses can quietly shape an entire life. A person stops expressing their feelings because they fear rejection. A person avoids relationships because they fear abandonment. A person never pursues opportunities because they fear failure. The original wound may have happened years ago, yet the brain continues acting as if the threat is still present. That is how powerful emotional pain can be. And perhaps the darkest truth of all is that many people underestimate the pain they cause others. They assume words are harmless. They assume exclusion is insignificant. They assume rejection is something people simply get over. But the brain does not always see it that way. To the nervous system, social wounds can feel startlingly similar to physical ones. A careless comment, a public embarrassment, a cruel rejection, a betrayal of trust. These experiences can leave marks that are invisible to everyone except the person carrying them, which means some of the deepest injuries people walk around with are the ones nobody can see. No cast, no scar, no evidence. Just a memory that still hurts years later. A reminder that the human brain was built to treat rejection as something far more serious than hurt feelings. Because deep down, part of your mind still lives in a world where being left behind was not just painful. It was a threat to survival itself. And that ancient fear still echoes through the brain every time someone makes you feel unwanted. Most generosity is performed for an invisible audience. Picture someone helping a stranger. Maybe they donate money to a family in need, spend hours helping a friend through a difficult time, or go out of their way to support someone who can offer them nothing in return. We usually look at acts like these and assume they come from a simple place: kindness, compassion, a genuine desire to help. And often, they do. But if you look a little deeper, a more uncomfortable question starts to emerge. If nobody could ever know about the good thing you did, not your friends, not your family, not society, and not even the person you helped, would you still be equally motivated to do it? Most people answer that question immediately. Of course they would. They want to believe their generosity is completely selfless. But human psychology is rarely that simple. The truth is that many acts of kindness are performed in front of an audience that nobody can see, an audience that exists entirely inside our own minds. Human beings care deeply about the kind of person they believe themselves to be. We all carry around an internal identity, a story about who we are. Some people see themselves as loyal. Others see themselves as hardworking, honest, compassionate, or generous. That self-image becomes one of the most important things we protect. In many ways, it becomes the lens through which we interpret our entire lives. This is where generosity becomes more complicated than it first appears. When you help someone, you are not only affecting their life, you are also reinforcing a belief about yourself. Every generous act becomes evidence that supports the story you want to believe. It quietly tells your mind that you are kind, caring, and morally good. That feeling is rewarding. In fact, studies have shown that acts of giving can activate reward centers in the brain. Helping others often produces genuine feelings of satisfaction, fulfillment, and emotional warmth. At first, that sounds like a beautiful thing, but it also creates an uncomfortable possibility. What if part of the reason people help others is because of how helping makes them feel about themselves? That does not mean the kindness is fake. The help is still real. The person receiving support still benefits. But it does suggest that our motivations are often more layered than we like to admit. Human beings rarely do things for a single reason. Even our best actions can be influenced by a mixture of compassion, emotion, self-interest, social pressure, and identity. You can see this dynamic everywhere. Think about how often people publicly share their charitable actions. Someone donates money and posts about it online. Someone volunteers and makes sure everyone knows. Someone performs a good deed and immediately tells others about it. On the surface, they may claim they are simply spreading awareness. Sometimes that is true, but other times something deeper is happening. The act is being witnessed. It is being acknowledged. It is becoming part of a public identity. We tend to believe that generosity and recognition are completely separate things, but they often overlap. Being seen as generous carries social value. People trust you more, respect you more, admire you more. Throughout human history, reputation has mattered. In small tribes and communities, being known as cooperative and generous could improve your chances of receiving support when you needed it. Our brains evolved in environments where social approval had real survival benefits. The fascinating part is that the audience does not always have to be real. Sometimes nobody else is watching at all. Sometimes the audience exists entirely within your own consciousness. Imagine finding a wallet full of cash on an empty street. There are no cameras nearby, no witnesses. Nobody would ever know if you kept it, yet many people would still return it. Why? Part of the answer is morality. But another part is that they would know. They would have to live with the knowledge of what they did. Their internal audience would still be watching. That internal audience can be surprisingly powerful. It constantly evaluates your actions against the image you hold of yourself. It rewards behavior that matches your identity and creates discomfort when your actions conflict with it. In many cases, people are not simply trying to look good in the eyes of others. They are trying to look good in their own eyes. This helps explain something interesting about generosity. Sometimes people become upset when their kindness goes unnoticed. They spend time helping someone, making sacrifices, or offering support, and when no appreciation comes back, they feel hurt. The reaction often surprises them because they believed they were acting purely out of selflessness. But if the act was completely detached from personal reward, why does the lack of recognition sting so much? The answer is that many people secretly expect something in return, even if it is not money or praise. Sometimes they want acknowledgement. Sometimes they want gratitude. Sometimes they simply want confirmation that their effort mattered. When that confirmation never arrives, disappointment reveals a hidden layer of motivation that was there all along. This does not make people selfish. It makes them human. We are social creatures. We naturally seek meaning in our actions, and part of that meaning often comes from knowing our efforts had value. The desire to be appreciated is deeply woven into human nature. What makes this psychological truth so unsettling is that it forces us to question our own motives. How much of our kindness comes from empathy, and how much comes from identity? How much comes from concern for others, and how much comes from maintaining a positive image of ourselves? There is rarely a clear answer, because both forces are usually operating at the same time. Perhaps the rarest form of generosity is the kind that leaves no trace, the kindness that nobody hears about, the sacrifice that receives no recognition, the help that brings no reward, no validation, and no acknowledgement. Those moments are powerful because they strip away every external incentive and leave only the act itself. The uncomfortable reality is that most generosity is not performed in complete isolation. It is performed under the gaze of an invisible audience. Sometimes that audience is society, sometimes it is the people around us. But more often, it is the silent observer living inside our own minds, constantly watching, constantly evaluating, and quietly reminding us of the kind of person we want to believe we are. You trust faces that quietly resemble your own. The first time you meet someone, your brain starts making judgments before you say a single word to each other. Before you learn their values, their intentions, or even their name, something inside you is already deciding whether this person feels safe, trustworthy, and familiar. Most people like to think these judgments are based on logic. They believe they evaluate character through behavior and experience. But the reality is much stranger than that. In many cases, people feel an unconscious sense of trust toward faces that resemble their own. Not enough for them to consciously notice it. Not enough for them to look at someone and think that person looks like me. The resemblance is often subtle, hidden beneath awareness. Yet the brain notices it anyway. Researchers have found that people frequently show a preference for faces that contain features similar to their own. Sometimes it is the shape of the eyes, sometimes the structure of the face, sometimes tiny characteristics that would be almost impossible to identify consciously. The person has no idea why they feel comfortable around someone, but comfort appears all the same. At first, this sounds harmless, maybe even understandable. Familiar things tend to feel safer. But once you realize how deeply this tendency influences human behavior, it becomes much harder to ignore. Think about how often people talk about trusting their instincts. They meet someone and immediately say they seem like a good person, or they claim something feels off about another individual despite having no evidence. Most of the time, they assume those reactions reveal insight. They believe their intuition is detecting something important. But what if that feeling has less to do with the other person's character and more to do with familiarity? The human brain is constantly searching for patterns. It evolved to identify what is known and what is unknown because, throughout history, familiar things were generally safer than unfamiliar ones. When something reminds the brain of what it already knows, alarm systems stay quiet. Tension decreases. Comfort increases. And nothing is more familiar than yourself. That means a face carrying subtle similarities to your own can create a sense of ease before any meaningful interaction has even taken place. The unsettling part is that trust often follows comfort. People assume they trust someone because that person has earned it. But many times, trust begins forming long before evidence enters the picture. A familiar face creates a positive feeling. The positive feeling creates a favorable impression, and the favorable impression quietly shapes how every future action gets interpreted. Imagine two strangers saying the exact same thing. One instantly feels relatable. The other feels unfamiliar. The first person's mistakes are forgiven more easily. Their intentions are interpreted more generously. Their flaws seem less threatening. The second person receives none of those advantages. The facts are identical. The perception is not. This helps explain something fascinating about human relationships. We often believe we are attracted to people because of their unique qualities. Yet many studies have found that individuals frequently choose partners who share certain physical characteristics with themselves. Not exact copies, of course. The resemblance is usually subtle, but it appears often enough to reveal a hidden pattern. The brain is drawn toward what feels familiar, and familiarity creates comfort. Comfort creates trust. Trust creates connection. What makes this psychological truth so dangerous is that it can distort judgment without us realizing it. A trustworthy appearance does not necessarily indicate a trustworthy person. Someone can look familiar and still deceive you. Someone can look unfamiliar and still be honest, loyal, and kind. Yet the brain often struggles to separate emotional comfort from objective reality. This is one reason why first impressions can be so misleading. People assume they are evaluating character when they are often evaluating feelings, and feelings can be influenced by factors that have nothing to do with morality, honesty, or integrity. The effect extends far beyond friendships and relationships. It appears in hiring decisions, leadership choices, political preferences, and countless social interactions. People often feel drawn toward individuals who seem relatable, even when they cannot explain why. They describe them as trustworthy, approachable, or authentic. What they may actually be responding to is a subtle sense of familiarity. In other words, people sometimes mistake resemblance for reliability. The frightening part is that this process happens automatically. You do not choose it. You do not consciously decide to trust someone because they remind you of yourself. The brain does it in the background. It creates a feeling first and then allows logic to catch up later. And once that feeling exists, it becomes surprisingly difficult to challenge. That is because human beings love certainty. We prefer believing our judgments come from careful observation rather than hidden biases. We want to think we are evaluating people fairly. The idea that something as simple as facial familiarity could influence trust feels almost insulting to our sense of rationality. Yet the evidence suggests otherwise. The brain constantly takes shortcuts. It uses familiar patterns to make quick decisions about the world. Most of the time, those shortcuts help us navigate life efficiently. But they also create blind spots. And some of those blind spots shape the people we trust, the opportunities we give, and the relationships we build. The darkest part of this truth is not that we trust familiar faces. It is that we often have no idea we are doing it. We tell ourselves stories about intuition, chemistry, and first impressions. We convince ourselves that our instincts are revealing something profound about another person. Sometimes they are. But other times, the feeling of trust has nothing to do with who the other person is. It comes from a quiet sense of recognition, a subtle reflection of ourselves staring back at us. And because the brain mistakes familiarity for safety, that reflection can feel trustworthy long before trust has actually been earned. Trauma doesn't just change your mind, it rewrites your DNA. Most people think trauma ends when the event is over. They imagine it as a terrible memory locked away somewhere in the mind, something painful that occasionally resurfaces when a certain smell, place, or situation brings it back. It sounds reasonable because trauma is usually discussed in psychological terms. We talk about emotional scars, painful memories, anxiety, fear, and stress. But one of the darkest discoveries in modern science suggests that trauma can reach far deeper than your thoughts. In some cases, it can leave marks so profound that they affect the very biological systems that shape how your body functions, responds to stress, and even prepares future generations for the world. For decades, people believed that DNA was essentially fixed. You inherited a genetic blueprint from your parents, and that blueprint remained largely unchanged throughout your life. Your experiences could influence your personality, your beliefs, and your behavior, but they could not reach down and alter the machinery controlling your genes. Then scientists began uncovering evidence that challenged this assumption. They discovered that experiences, especially intense and prolonged stress, could influence how certain genes are expressed. The DNA code itself might remain the same, but the way that code is activated can change. This field of research became known as epigenetics, and it revealed something both fascinating and disturbing. Life experiences do not always stay in the realm of memory. Sometimes they leave biological fingerprints. To understand why this matters, think about what trauma actually does to the human body. When a person experiences something overwhelming, whether it is abuse, violence, neglect, war, betrayal, or a devastating loss, the brain immediately shifts into survival mode. Stress hormones flood the body. Heart rate increases. Attention narrows. Every system becomes focused on one objective, staying alive. In the short term, this response is incredibly useful. It is the reason human beings can react quickly during dangerous situations. The problem is that trauma often teaches the body a lesson it never fully forgets. Instead of learning that a threat happened, the nervous system learns that danger is everywhere. That distinction changes everything. A traumatic event may last minutes, hours, or days, but the survival adaptations it creates can last for years. Someone who experienced severe trauma may become hypervigilant, constantly scanning their environment for signs of danger. They may overreact to situations that appear harmless to everyone else. Loud noises, certain facial expressions, or seemingly minor conflicts can trigger intense emotional responses. To outsiders, these reactions may seem irrational, but from the perspective of the nervous system, they make perfect sense. The body is not reacting to the present moment. It is reacting to a lesson it learned in the past. What makes this even more unsettling is that researchers studying trauma began noticing patterns that extended beyond individual lives. Studies involving survivors of extreme hardships, including war, famine, and severe persecution, suggested that the biological effects of trauma could sometimes be detected in their children as well. In other words, experiences that happened to one generation appeared capable of influencing stress responses in the next. The children did not inherit the memories themselves, but they may have inherited biological tendencies shaped by those experiences. Imagine how strange that idea is. A person survives a catastrophic event decades ago. The event ends. Life continues. Families grow. New generations are born. Yet traces of that original trauma may still be influencing how bodies respond to stress long after the people involved are gone. It is almost as though the body keeps a record of what the mind can no longer remember. Consider a population that endured years of famine. During that period, Survival depended on adapting to extreme scarcity. The body learned that resources could disappear at any moment. Researchers later found evidence suggesting that descendants of people who lived through such conditions sometimes carried biological differences linked to those experiences. The original famine was over, but the echoes remained. The body had adapted to one world and quietly passed some of those adaptations forward. This realization forces us to rethink how we understand human suffering. Most people assume their fears, anxieties, and emotional tendencies belong entirely to them. They see these traits as personal characteristics. But what if some of the reactions you experience today were influenced by events that occurred before you were even born? What if part of your relationship with stress was shaped by struggles faced by people whose names you may never know? That does not mean every problem can be traced to inherited trauma. Human behavior is far too complex for that. Personality, environment, relationships, culture, and individual experiences all play enormous roles. But the possibility that trauma can leave biological traces challenges the comforting belief that suffering ends with the person who experiences it. At the same time, there is an important detail that often gets overlooked when people discuss this topic. Trauma may leave biological marks, but so can healing. The human body is remarkably adaptable. Safe relationships, supportive environments, meaningful connections, and positive experiences can influence the same systems that trauma affects. Just as prolonged stress can shape the body's responses, prolonged safety can help reshape them. The brain remains capable of change throughout life, and the body constantly responds to the conditions it experiences. Still, the core truth remains difficult to ignore. Trauma is not just a painful memory stored somewhere in the mind. It is a force capable of influencing the body at multiple levels, altering how people respond to stress, shaping patterns of behavior, and potentially leaving effects that extend beyond a single lifetime. The darkest part is realizing that some experiences do not simply disappear when they are over. They can become woven into the biology of survival itself, leaving traces that continue long after the original event has faded into history. When most people think of trauma, they imagine a wound in the mind. The reality may be far stranger. Sometimes the wound reaches deep enough to change the very systems that help define what it means to be human. Loud confidence almost always hides the deepest wound. Some of the most insecure people you will ever meet are not quiet. They are not shy. They are not hiding in the corner of the room avoiding attention. In fact, they are often the exact opposite. They are the loudest voices in the conversation, the people who constantly need to be noticed, admired, respected, and acknowledged. They walk into a room and immediately try to establish dominance. They make sure everyone knows their achievements, their status, their intelligence, or their importance. To most people, they appear incredibly confident, but confidence and certainty are not always the same thing, and what looks like strength on the surface can sometimes be a desperate attempt to hide something much deeper. Most of us grow up believing that confidence is simply confidence. We assume that people who speak loudly, act boldly, and seem completely sure of themselves must possess high self-esteem. It feels like an obvious conclusion. After all, why would someone project such certainty if they did not genuinely believe in themselves? The uncomfortable answer is that certainty is often used as armor. Sometimes the people who seem most convinced of their own worth are actually fighting an internal battle to convince themselves. Think about how genuine confidence behaves. Truly confident people usually do not need constant validation. They do not feel an overwhelming need to prove themselves in every conversation. They can admit mistakes without feeling destroyed by them. They can listen without immediately turning the spotlight back onto themselves. Their sense of worth feels stable because it is not entirely dependent on what other people think. Now compare that to someone whose confidence is built on a fragile foundation. Every disagreement feels like a threat. Every criticism feels like an attack. Every success must be displayed, and every failure must be hidden. They are not protecting confidence. They are protecting a wound. Psychologists have long observed that people often develop compensatory behaviors to deal with painful feelings about themselves. When a person secretly feels inadequate, powerless, or unworthy, they may unconsciously build a personality designed to cover those feelings. Instead of confronting the wound directly, they construct an image that appears strong enough to hide it. The problem is that the image eventually becomes exhausting to maintain because it requires constant reinforcement from the outside world. This is why some people become addicted to praise. They are not chasing compliments because compliments feel good. Everyone enjoys appreciation. They are chasing compliments because the praise temporarily silences a fear they cannot escape. For a brief moment, the applause drowns out the voice telling them they are not enough. The validation acts like pain medication. It relieves the discomfort without healing the underlying injury. You can see this pattern everywhere once you start looking for it. The person who constantly talks about their success may be terrified of feeling insignificant. The person who needs to dominate every discussion may secretly fear being ignored. The person who acts untouchable may be deeply afraid of rejection. What appears to be confidence is sometimes compensation. This does not mean every confident person is secretly broken. That would be an oversimplification. Genuine confidence absolutely exists. But there is usually a difference you can feel. Genuine confidence tends to be calm. It does not need to announce itself every few minutes. It does not panic when challenged. It does not depend entirely on winning, impressing, or being admired. It has a quiet stability to it. Performative confidence often feels different. It demands attention. It demands recognition. It demands agreement. Beneath the surface, there is a constant need for external confirmation because the internal foundation is weak. The louder the performance becomes, the more likely it is that something fragile is being protected underneath. One reason this happens is because emotional wounds rarely disappear on their own. A child who grows up feeling unseen may become an adult who desperately needs attention. Someone who was constantly criticized may spend years chasing perfection. Someone who never felt valued may build an identity around proving their worth to everyone around them. The original wound may have happened decades earlier, but the survival strategy remains active. What makes this truth especially difficult to accept is that many people are completely unaware of what they are doing. They genuinely believe they are pursuing success, status, power, or recognition because those things matter to them. They do not realize that beneath those goals is often a much older emotional need. The mind is incredibly skilled at disguising pain as ambition. It takes a deep wound and wraps it in a socially acceptable narrative. This is why some people achieve everything they thought they wanted and still feel empty. They reach the top of the mountain only to discover that the climb was never really about success. It was about trying to escape a feeling. And no amount of money, status, praise, or achievement can permanently erase an emotional wound that has never been addressed. The darker reality is that society often rewards these behaviors. We celebrate relentless ambition, endless self-promotion, and displays of dominance. We mistake them for strength because they look powerful from the outside. Meanwhile, the quieter forms of confidence often go unnoticed because they do not demand attention. The person who is secure does not need everyone to know they are secure. If you pay attention, you will notice something surprising. The people who seem most desperate to prove their value are often the ones who doubt it the most. The people who constantly need reassurance are often the ones carrying the deepest uncertainty. And the people who appear invincible are sometimes the ones working hardest to keep others from seeing where they hurt. That is what makes this psychological truth so unsettling. We spend our lives assuming confidence reveals strength, when in many cases it reveals protection. It is not always a window into what someone has overcome. Sometimes it is a shield covering what they never healed. The loud voice, the constant need to impress, the endless pursuit of admiration, and the refusal to appear vulnerable can all serve the same purpose. They keep people from looking too closely at the wound underneath. And once you understand that, you start seeing confidence differently. Not as proof that someone has no insecurities, but as a signal worth examining more carefully. Because sometimes the strongest display in the room is not evidence of strength at all. Sometimes it is evidence of how desperately someone is trying to hide the place where they still hurt. More options don't free you, they disappoint you. Most people spend their lives believing that more choice means more freedom. More opportunities, more possibilities, more paths to take. It sounds like the perfect formula for happiness. If having a few options is good, then having hundreds must be even better. That is the logic modern life constantly sells us. More careers to pursue, more people to date, more products to buy, more content to watch, and more ways to spend every hour of the day. We are surrounded by options, and yet something strange has happened. Instead of becoming more satisfied, many people have become more frustrated, more anxious, and more disappointed than ever before. At first, this makes no sense. Freedom is supposed to feel liberating. Having choices is supposed to make life easier. So why do so many people feel overwhelmed when faced with endless possibilities? Why do people spend 20 minutes scrolling through movies only to watch nothing? Why do they spend years searching for the perfect partner while feeling increasingly dissatisfied with every relationship? Why do they achieve goals they once desperately wanted and still wonder if they chose the wrong path? The answer lies in a psychological trap that most people never notice. Every choice creates not only a gain but also a loss. The moment you choose one option, you automatically give up every alternative. When there are only 2 or 3 possibilities, that sacrifice feels manageable. But when there are hundreds, the mind becomes obsessed with everything it did not choose. Imagine walking into a small restaurant with 5 items on the menu. You make a decision, enjoy your meal, and move on with your day. Now imagine walking into a restaurant with 500 options. Suddenly, the experience feels completely different. You spend more time comparing, second-guessing, and worrying about making the wrong decision. Even after you choose, part of your mind keeps wondering whether something better was available. The meal itself may be identical in quality, but your satisfaction changes because your attention is divided between what you have and what you might have had. This pattern appears everywhere in modern life. Dating apps provide access to more potential partners than any generation in human history. Social media exposes people to countless lifestyles, careers, and experiences. Online stores offer millions of products. Streaming platforms contain more entertainment than a person could consume in several lifetimes. On paper, this abundance should make people happier. Yet often it does the opposite. When possibilities become endless, satisfaction becomes difficult because the mind never stops comparing. Every decision feels temporary. Every commitment feels risky. Every choice carries the fear that something better might be waiting just around the corner. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as the paradox of choice. As options increase, so does the pressure to choose perfectly. The decision stops being about what is good and starts becoming about what is best. And once the brain starts chasing the best possible outcome, disappointment becomes almost inevitable. Think about how people approached relationships in the past. They certainly faced challenges, but they were not constantly exposed to thousands of alternative possibilities every day. Today, many people enter relationships while being continuously reminded that there are countless other options available. Even when they find someone who makes them genuinely happy, part of their mind quietly wonders whether someone even better exists. The relationship itself may not be the problem. The endless comparison is. The same thing happens with careers. A person chooses a profession they enjoy only to spend years comparing themselves to people who chose different paths. Someone else appears richer. Someone else seems happier. Someone else has more freedom. Instead of appreciating the value of their own choice, they become consumed by the opportunities they left behind. The tragedy is that every life requires sacrifice. No matter what path you choose, there will always be roads you never travel. But modern culture constantly places those unchosen roads directly in front of your eyes. As a result, people often experience something strange. They get exactly what they wanted and still feel dissatisfied. Not because the choice was wrong, but because their attention remains fixed on everything they did not choose. The human brain is particularly vulnerable to this because it is built to imagine alternatives. It constantly asks questions. What if I had chosen differently? What if there was something better? What if I settled too soon? These thoughts can be useful in moderation, but when options become limitless, they transform into a source of endless dissatisfaction. What makes this truth especially dark is that many people never realize what is happening. They assume their unhappiness means they have not found the right option yet. So they keep searching. They switch careers, relationships, cities, hobbies, and goals, believing the next choice will finally eliminate the feeling. But the feeling often follows them because the problem was never the options themselves. The problem was the belief that a perfect option exists. Once people start chasing perfection, every real experience becomes disappointing. Real jobs have flaws. Real relationships have imperfections. Real opportunities come with trade-offs. The fantasy of a perfect alternative will always appear superior because it exists only in the imagination. And imagination has no limitations. This is why some of the happiest people are not necessarily those with the most choices. They are often the people who fully commit to the choices they have already made. Instead of constantly evaluating alternatives, they invest their energy into building meaning from what is in front of them. That idea feels almost backwards in a world obsessed with maximizing options. Yet there is a profound psychological truth hidden inside it. Satisfaction does not come from having access to every possibility. Satisfaction comes from making peace with the fact that every choice closes other doors. The darker reality is that endless options create endless opportunities for regret. The more possibilities you have, the more alternate lives your mind can imagine. And the more alternate lives your mind imagines, the harder it becomes to appreciate the one you are actually living. That is why more options do not always feel like freedom. Sometimes they feel like a burden. Sometimes they create anxiety, doubt, and disappointment. And sometimes the thing people spend their lives chasing is the very thing preventing them from feeling content. Because the mind that believes happiness is hiding in the next option will never fully enjoy the one it already has. Overpraised children build the most fragile identities. Most people assume you can never give a child too much praise. It sounds harmless, even beneficial. After all, what could possibly be wrong with making a child feel special? Parents are constantly told to boost confidence, celebrate achievements, and remind children how amazing they are. The intention is usually good. Nobody wants a child to grow up doubting their worth. But there is a psychological truth hiding beneath this well-meaning advice that few people talk about. Sometimes too much praise does not create confidence. It creates fragility. At first, that sounds backwards. Praise is supposed to strengthen self-esteem, not weaken it. Yet some of the most emotionally fragile adults were children who spent years being told they were exceptional. The problem is not encouragement itself. Children need support, validation, and recognition. The problem begins when praise becomes disconnected from reality and starts replacing genuine self-worth with something far more unstable. Think about what happens when a child is constantly told they are brilliant, talented, gifted, or extraordinary regardless of what they actually do. At first, it feels empowering. The child develops a positive image of themselves. But over time, something subtle starts to happen. Their identity becomes tied to being impressive rather than growing. Instead of learning that mistakes are part of development, they begin learning that their value comes from maintaining a particular image. That distinction changes everything. A child who is praised for effort learns that growth matters. A child who is endlessly praised for being special learns that appearing special matters. One develops resilience. The other develops pressure. Psychologists have observed that when children are excessively praised for traits rather than effort, they often become more afraid of failure. That seems strange until you understand what is happening beneath the surface. If your identity depends on being smart, every mistake becomes evidence that you might not be. If your identity depends on being talented, every struggle becomes a threat. Failure is no longer just a temporary setback. It becomes a challenge to who you believe you are. As a result, many overpraised children grow into adults who avoid situations where they might fail. They choose safe challenges instead of meaningful ones. They hesitate to take risks. They become obsessed with protecting their image because their self-worth was built on maintaining that image in the first place. This creates a paradox. The very praise that was supposed to make them confident can leave them terrified of discovering their limits. You can often see the effects later in life. Some people cannot handle criticism, even when it is constructive. A single negative comment lingers in their mind for days. Others become addicted to validation. They constantly seek approval, recognition, and reassurance because their sense of worth depends on external feedback. When praise disappears, they feel lost. Not because they lack ability, but because they never learned how to separate their value from other people's opinions. The most painful part is that many of these individuals appear confident on the surface. They may have impressive achievements, successful careers, or strong public images. Yet underneath, there is often a quiet fear. A fear that they are not as exceptional as they were told. A fear that one mistake, one failure, or one criticism will expose them. That fear can become exhausting. Imagine spending your life trying to live up to an identity that was handed to you as a child. Every achievement feels temporary because it only proves your worth for a moment. Every success creates pressure to succeed again. Every compliment becomes something you must earn repeatedly. Instead of feeling secure, you become trapped in a cycle of performance. What makes this especially dark is that the people creating the problem usually have the best intentions. Parents praise their children because they want them to feel loved. Teachers encourage students because they want them to believe in themselves. Nobody sets out to create insecurity, but confidence built entirely on praise is like a building constructed on unstable ground. It may look impressive for years, yet the first major challenge can reveal how fragile the foundation really is. True confidence develops differently. It comes from learning that your value survives mistakes. It comes from discovering that failure does not make you worthless. It comes from facing difficulties, struggling, improving, and realizing that growth matters more than perfection. People with genuine confidence do not need to believe they are extraordinary all the time. They simply trust their ability to handle reality, even when reality is uncomfortable. Overpraised children often miss this lesson because they spend too much time protecting an identity instead of developing one. They become attached to being seen a certain way rather than becoming comfortable with who they actually are. As long as the world keeps providing praise, everything feels fine. But life eventually tests everyone. Failure arrives. Rejection arrives. Criticism arrives. And when those moments come, an identity built primarily on admiration can crack surprisingly fast. This is why some people seem devastated by setbacks that others recover from relatively quickly. The setback itself is not the real problem. The threat to identity is losing a competition, failing an exam, being rejected, or receiving criticism feels unbearable because it challenges the story they have spent years believing about themselves. The irony is that children do not need to believe they are perfect to become strong. They need to learn that imperfection is survivable. They need to discover that mistakes are not evidence of inadequacy. They need experiences that teach them they can fall short, learn, adapt, and keep moving forward. That process creates something far more durable than constant praise ever could. The darkest part of this truth is that many adults spend decades chasing the feeling that endless praise once gave them. They seek it in careers, relationships, social media, and achievements. They become dependent on external approval because it feels familiar. Yet no amount of validation is ever enough when self-worth depends on hearing it from others. Eventually, they discover something painful. The identity built on admiration was never as strong as it seemed. It was strong only as long as people kept clapping. And that is why overpraised children often grow into adults with the most fragile identities. Their sense of self was built around being exceptional, but life does not reward anyone with constant applause. Sooner or later, everyone encounters failure, criticism, and disappointment. The people who survive those moments are not usually the ones who were taught they were special. They are the ones who learned that their value does not disappear when the praise does. Your brain fabricates nearly half of what you think you see. Right now, in this moment, you are watching or listening with complete confidence that what you perceive is what is actually there. The room around you, the screen in front of you, the faces you recognize, the objects you reach for without looking, all of it feels like direct, unfiltered access to reality, like your eyes are simply windows, and your brain is simply receiving what comes through them. That confidence is one of the most deeply embedded assumptions a human being carries, and it is also one of the most wrong. What you experience as vision is not a recording of the external world. It is a construction, a sophisticated, mostly convincing, constantly updated fabrication assembled by a brain that is working with far less information than you think and filling in the rest on its own, using prediction, pattern recognition, and memory rather than actual incoming data. Here is the part that is genuinely difficult to absorb. The optic nerve, the structure that carries visual information from your eye to your brain, has a blind spot where it connects to the retina. There are no photoreceptors at that point. No visual data comes from that region at all. And yet you do not experience a hole in your vision. You experience a seamless, uninterrupted visual field, because your brain takes the surrounding information and quietly paints over the gap. It fabricates that portion of what you see and presents it to you as though it was received. You have been looking at a completed, filled-in image your entire life without knowing that pieces of it were invented. But that is just the beginning. The deeper issue is that the brain does not wait for visual input before forming a picture of the world. It predicts first. Neuroscientist Carl Friston's predictive processing framework, which has become one of the most influential models in modern neuroscience, proposes that the brain is fundamentally a prediction machine. It constantly generates a model of what it expects to see based on prior experience, and then it compares incoming sensory data not to reality directly, but to its own predictions. What you consciously perceive is not the raw input from your eyes. It is the brain's best guess about the world, updated only when the incoming data deviates enough from the prediction to require a correction. In other words, you are mostly seeing what your brain expected to see, with the actual incoming visual data serving more as a correction mechanism than a source of truth. The implications of this become strikingly clear in the research on change blindness and inattentional blindness. In the now famous gorilla experiment by Christopher Chabris and Daniel Simons, participants were asked to watch a video and count how many times a group of people in white shirts passed a basketball. During the video, a person in a gorilla suit walked directly through the scene, stopped in the center, beat their chest, and walked away. Approximately 50% of participants did not see the gorilla at all, not because their eyes failed to register it. The visual information was there, but their brain, focused on the task of counting passes, had allocated its predictive resources elsewhere and simply did not process what was outside its current model of what mattered. The gorilla was invisible not because it was hidden but because the brain decided it was not relevant enough to construct into conscious experience. This is not a flaw in those particular participants. It is the standard operating procedure of every human brain. Conscious visual experience represents only a fraction of the total visual information your eyes receive. The brain makes constant executive decisions about what to render into awareness and what to discard, and those decisions are shaped by expectation, attention, emotion, prior experience, and current goal. Two people standing side by side in the same room are not having the same visual experience. They are each seeing the world their own brain has constructed from the same raw material, and those constructions can differ in ways that are subtle or profound, depending on what each brain expected and prioritized. The harder implication is what this means for memory and testimony and conflict. When two people remember the same event differently, the instinct is to assume one of them is lying or mistaken. But what the neuroscience suggests is that they may both be reporting their constructions accurately, and those constructions may have diverged before conscious memory even began, back at the level of what each brain decided to fabricate into perception in the first place. The disagreement is not always about interpretation. Sometimes it starts at the level of what was actually seen, because what was actually seen was never the same thing to begin with. You are not watching the world. You are watching your brain's model of the world, rendered in real time, updated continuously, and confident enough in its own fabrications that it never thinks to mention they are fabrications. The version of reality you have trusted your entire life is accurate enough to function in, and that is genuinely impressive. But accurate enough to function in and objectively true are not the same thing, and the distance between them is larger than most people are ever asked to consider. The constant smiler is often the hardest to trust. Most people are taught from a very early age that a smile means safety. It is one of the first social signals a human infant learns to read. A smiling face means welcome, warmth, approach rather than retreat. By the time we are adults, this association is so deeply wired that we extend trust almost automatically to people who smile readily, who seem consistently warm, who project an unbroken cheerfulness regardless of circumstance. We interpret that brightness as openness, as honesty, as evidence that someone has nothing to hide. But there is a layer underneath that assumption that does not hold up when you examine it carefully. And once you see it, you start to notice something that was always there in the background of certain social interactions. The people who never stop smiling are often the ones you know the least. Human facial expression is not just output. It is communication in both directions. When someone allows their face to shift genuinely in response to what is happening around them, showing frustration, confusion, uncertainty, tiredness, the occasional unguarded moment of something difficult, they are giving you access. They are letting their internal state become visible. That visibility is the foundation of intimacy and trust. You know where you stand with someone whose face tells you the truth about where they are. But a face that is permanently set to one expression, regardless of what is actually being experienced underneath, is a face that is performing rather than communicating. And a performance, however warm and practiced it may be, is by definition a barrier between you and the person behind it. The psychology here is rooted in something called emotional masking, and it is far more common than most people recognize. Emotional masking is the practice of presenting a regulated, socially acceptable emotional exterior, while the actual internal emotional experience is something entirely different. It is not the same as being polite or professional. Everyone moderates their expression in certain contexts, and that is a healthy social skill. Emotional masking at the chronic level is something different. It is the habitual suppression of any emotional signal that might create discomfort, invite unwanted questions, or make the person appear anything other than fine. And people who have been doing it for long enough become extraordinarily good at it. The smile is no longer something they put on. It becomes the default face they wear in every room, with every person, under every circumstance. Paul Ekman, the psychologist who spent decades studying facial expression and developed the most comprehensive framework for reading micro-expressions, drew a clear distinction between what he called the Duchenne smile and the non-Duchenne smile. A genuine smile involves involuntary muscle movements around the eyes that cannot be consciously controlled. A social smile, the kind that is produced for effect rather than felt, typically does not include those eye muscles. The face looks similar enough at a glance, but the information being communicated is completely different. Most people cannot consciously identify this distinction in real time, but the research suggests we register it unconsciously. There is something that does not quite land when a smile is constant and unvarying, something the gut picks up on even when the conscious mind is still extending trust. What makes the constant smiler genuinely difficult to trust is not that they intend to deceive. Most of the time, the masking is not malicious at all. It is often the result of environments where showing real emotion was unsafe, where vulnerability was punished, where being anything other than pleasant had consequences. The smile is a survival adaptation that became a permanent fixture. But regardless of where it came from, the functional reality is the same. You cannot build genuine trust with someone whose interior life is never visible to you. Trust requires knowing that when something is wrong, you will be told. It requires knowing that the emotional signals you are receiving correspond to something real. When the signal is always identical regardless of circumstance, you have lost the ability to read the person accurately, and you cannot trust what you cannot read. There is also a particular dynamic worth naming that happens over time with people who perform consistent positivity, because they never signal distress, need, or difficulty. The people around them tend to stop offering support. Why would you check on someone who always seems fine? And so the person behind the constant smile often becomes progressively more isolated in the most invisible way possible, surrounded by warmth and company, while carrying everything alone. The smiling continues because that is the role that was established, and the role by now has become load-bearing. Remove it, and everything underneath becomes visible. That prospect of being truly seen after years of being perfectly presented is often the most frightening thing of all. A smile should be a moment of genuine connection between what someone feels and what they show you. When it is permanent, it becomes its opposite. Not a window, but a wall, polished smooth, reflecting your own warmth back at you while telling you nothing about what lives on the other side. The most moral people crack the fastest under authority. Most people have a theory about themselves when it comes to morality. They believe that if they were ever placed in a situation where they were asked to do something genuinely wrong, they would refuse. They would speak up. They would be the person who does not go along with it. And the people who tend to hold this belief most confidently, the ones who think most carefully about ethics, who care most deeply about doing right, who have built their identity around being a good and principled person. Those are often precisely the people who are the most vulnerable to collapsing under the weight of an authority figure telling them to comply. Not because they are hypocrites, but because the same moral seriousness that makes them principled in ordinary life makes them uniquely susceptible to a particular kind of psychological trap that authority sets with devastating precision. In 1961, psychologist Stanley Milgram ran what became one of the most disturbing and consequential experiments in the history of social science. He recruited ordinary people for what they were told was a study on learning and memory. Each participant was assigned the role of teacher and instructed to administer electric shocks to a learner in another room every time the learner gave a wrong answer, with the voltage increasing with each mistake. The learner was an actor. The shocks were not real. But the participants did not know that. What they heard through the wall was someone expressing pain, then pleading to stop, then going ominously silent. And when participants hesitated or tried to stop, the experimenter, a calm authority figure in a lab coat, simply said things like, "Please continue," or "The experiment requires that you go on." 65% of participants administered what they believed to be the maximum shock, labeled on the machine as 450 volts, a level marked with the words "severe shock." Not a fringe group. Not people with identifiable cruelty in their character. Ordinary, morally concerned people who were deeply distressed by what they were doing and did it anyway because an authority figure told them to continue. But here is the finding that almost nobody discusses when they reference Milgram, the one that makes this truth genuinely dark. The participants who showed the most visible distress, who sweated and trembled and verbally protested and clearly hated every moment of what they were doing, were not significantly more likely to stop than the ones who appeared calmer. Their moral anguish was real. Their sense that something was wrong was functioning exactly as it should, and it made almost no difference to their behavior. The feeling of wrongness and the act of stopping are not the same thing, and authority exploits the gap between them with frightening efficiency. The reason the most conscientious people are particularly vulnerable comes down to something called the agentic state, a concept Milgram himself developed to explain the results. When a person perceives themselves as operating within a legitimate hierarchy, carrying out instructions from a credible authority, rather than acting on their own initiative, they undergo a psychological shift in how they assign moral responsibility. They do not stop feeling that something is wrong, but they relocate the responsibility for that wrongness onto the authority above them. They become, in their own minds, an instrument rather than an agent. And people who care deeply about morality, who are hyper-aware of the weight of personal responsibility in ordinary life, often find this shift almost irresistible because it offers something they genuinely want, a way to act without bearing the full moral cost of the action. The conscientious person does not become cruel under authority. They become compliant. And compliance feels different from cruelty. It feels like following procedure, like being professional, like trusting the system, like not making a scene over something that is probably fine. Each small step of compliance feels manageable, and the architecture of authority is specifically designed to deliver instructions in small steps, so that by the time the full scope of what you are participating in becomes clear, you are already too far in to easily turn back without confronting the weight of everything you already did. What Milgram uncovered is not a story about evil. It is a story about the conditions under which ordinary moral concern becomes functionally useless. The lesson is not that you are secretly capable of cruelty, though that is the reading that gets the most attention. The deeper lesson is that good values, earnestly held, are not sufficient protection against systems designed to override them. Moral courage is not the same as moral feeling. Knowing something is wrong and being willing to act on that knowledge at personal cost, even when an authority is watching, even when the system is pulling in the opposite direction, that is a capacity that has to be developed deliberately. It does not arrive automatically with good intentions. And most people, including the most principled ones, have never been asked to build it. Being in love looks identical to OCD inside the brain. Falling in love is supposed to be one of the most uniquely beautiful experiences a human being can have. Culture has spent thousands of years celebrating it in poetry, music, religion, and mythology. It is treated as the pinnacle of human feeling, something that elevates you, that makes life feel more vivid and meaningful than it ever did before. And none of that is wrong exactly. The experience is real, and it is powerful, and for the people inside it, it feels like nothing else. What is also true, and considerably harder to romanticize, is what is happening inside the brain during that experience. Because when neuroscientists and psychiatrists started comparing the neurochemistry of early romantic love to the neurochemistry of obsessive-compulsive disorder, they found something that the poets never mentioned. The two states are, at a biological level, almost indistinguishable. In 1999, psychiatrist Donatella Marazziti at the University of Pisa ran a study that should have generated much more cultural conversation than it did. She measured serotonin levels in 3 groups: people who had recently fallen in love, people diagnosed with obsessive-compulsive disorder, and a control group of people who were neither. What she found was that the people who had recently fallen in love and the people with OCD had serotonin levels that were dramatically lower than the control group by approximately 40%. The same neurochemical signature, the same measurable disruption to the system that regulates intrusive thoughts, repetitive mental loops, and the ability to shift attention away from a fixed point of focus. Being newly in love and having a clinically recognized anxiety disorder were, in this specific and significant way, the same thing happening inside a brain. Think about what early romantic love actually feels like from the inside. You cannot stop thinking about the person. They appear in your thoughts uninvited, constantly, regardless of what you are trying to focus on. You replay conversations in exhaustive detail. You analyze their words and expressions for hidden meaning. You feel a compulsive need to check your phone, to reach out, to confirm that what you felt was real and reciprocated. You experience intrusive thoughts about what could go wrong. Your attention is hijacked. Your concentration is compromised. Your sense of self temporarily reorganizes itself around another person. If someone described this set of symptoms without the romantic context, in a clinical intake form, they would be describing the hallmarks of an obsessive episode. The context is the only thing that changes the interpretation. This is not a cynical reading of love. It is a neurological one, and the mechanism makes evolutionary sense once you understand what the brain is trying to accomplish. Early romantic attachment serves a reproductive and survival function. From the brain's perspective, securing a mate is urgent enough to justify temporarily overriding normal cognitive function in order to keep that person at the center of your attention. The obsessive quality of new love is not a malfunction. It is the system working exactly as designed, allocating enormous cognitive and emotional resources to the pursuit and maintenance of a bond the brain has decided is high priority. The serotonin drop is part of that design. It is what makes the person feel impossible to stop thinking about, because the brain has essentially removed the neurochemical brake that would normally allow you to disengage from a repetitive thought. There is also dopamine running underneath all of this in a way that deepens the parallel. The dopamine system involved in early love is the same reward and craving system activated by addictive substances. When you are with the person you love, dopamine floods the reward circuits. When you are away from them, there is a withdrawal effect. The longing you feel is not metaphorical. It is chemically identical to craving. And like any dopamine-driven state, the system habituates over time. The intensity diminishes not because the love has died, but because the brain has recalibrated. Serotonin levels normalize, the obsessive quality fades, and what remains is a different kind of attachment built on different neurochemical foundations than what began it. Most people experience this transition as falling out of love, when it is actually just the brain returning to baseline from what was, in measurable terms, a temporary and voluntary neurological disorder. What this means for how people interpret their relationships is significant and largely unexplored in mainstream conversation. The intensity of early romantic feeling is often treated as the standard against which all subsequent feeling is measured. When the obsessive quality fades, people assume something has been lost, that the love has diminished, that the relationship has cooled in a way that signals trouble. But the obsessive phase was never a sustainable state. It was a neurologically altered one. The brain was not in love the way we imagine love to be. It was in a state of chemically induced preoccupation that served a specific short-term biological purpose and was always going to end. Understanding that does not make love less real. It makes it more honest. The love that remains after the serotonin stabilizes and the dopamine craving quiets. The one that is built from choice and familiarity and genuine knowledge of another person. That is a different neurological animal entirely, and arguably a far more impressive one, because it does not require a disorder to sustain it. People who claim they never lie are usually the most deceptive. At some point in your life, you have almost certainly met someone who announces their own honesty. They say things like, "I am brutally honest," or "I always tell it like it is," or "I just cannot lie, it is not in my nature," and something about it probably registered as slightly off, even if you could not explain why. Because on the surface the claim sounds admirable. Honesty is a virtue. Declaring yourself honest seems like exactly the kind of thing an honest person would do. But the research on deception, self-perception, and social behavior tells a different and considerably more uncomfortable story. The loudest declarations of personal honesty are not a reliable signal of truthfulness. In many cases they function as the opposite. They are the cover story, and the person most convinced they are telling you the truth about themselves is often the one most engaged in the deepest form of deception there is. The first thing to understand is what lying actually is in the full scope of human communication. Most people think of lying as the deliberate statement of something they know to be false. And that kind of lying, the conscious, calculated kind, is certainly real. But it is only one small slice of the deception spectrum. Psychologist Robert Feldman at the University of Massachusetts spent years studying everyday dishonesty and found that in a typical 10-minute conversation with a stranger, people tell an average of 2 to 3 lies. Not malicious lies in most cases. Exaggerations, omissions, softened truths, flattering distortions. Things said to manage the impression the other person forms rather than to communicate what is actually true. Most participants in his studies were genuinely surprised when shown the recordings of their own conversations. They had not experienced themselves as lying. They had experienced themselves as being normal, socially functional human beings, because for most people the vast majority of their deception is invisible to themselves. This is the mechanism that makes the self-proclaimed honest person so particularly unreliable. Conscious lying requires awareness of the gap between what is true and what you are saying. But the most pervasive form of human deception operates entirely beneath that awareness. It happens through selective emphasis, through the stories people construct about their own motives and character, through the way memory conveniently edits and rearranges events to cast the self in a more favorable light. The person who announces they never lie is almost always referring to the conscious, deliberate kind. They have not examined and are not aware of the ocean of motivated distortion operating underneath their self-concept. And because they genuinely believe the announcement, it carries a conviction that makes it persuasive in a way that a calculated lie often does not. There is also a specific social function that the honesty declaration tends to serve that is worth naming directly. Telling someone you are honest is a preemptive credibility move. It is designed, usually unconsciously, to establish a frame in which your subsequent statements are trusted and your trustworthiness is not examined too closely. The person who says, "I am someone who always tells the truth," is asking you to skip the process of evaluating whether their particular statements are reliable and simply extend them a blanket of credibility that their behavior has not necessarily earned. That blanket is enormously useful if you are someone whose behavior does not consistently hold up to scrutiny, and the frequency with which people reach for it correlates more strongly with a need to manage perception than with actual transparency. Psychologists who study self-deception, and it is a substantial and well-developed field, consistently find that people with low insight into their own biases and motivations tend to have the most confident self-assessments. The Dunning-Kruger effect is typically discussed in terms of competence, but it applies equally to character. The person with the least awareness of their own capacity for deception is the one most likely to describe themselves as exceptionally honest, because they have never done the work of examining where their own distortions lie. They look inward, see no conscious lying, and conclude that none is happening. It is a conclusion that feels like self-knowledge, but is actually its absence. The genuinely honest person tends to say something quite different. They are usually more hesitant about strong claims regarding their own character. They acknowledge that they sometimes shade the truth without meaning to, that memory is imperfect and self-serving, that they have blind spots they cannot fully see. That kind of epistemic humility about oneself is not weakness or false modesty. It is the accurate report of someone who has actually looked. Honesty about honesty turns out to be one of the rarest and most genuinely trustworthy qualities a person can demonstrate. Not because admitting imperfection is noble in itself, but because the willingness to see clearly where you fall short is the same capacity required to stop falling short. The next time someone tells you unprompted that they are an honest person, that is not information about their honesty. It is information about their need to be seen as honest. Those are two very different things, and the gap between them is exactly where you should be paying attention. A grudge costs your mind more than the original wound. The person who wronged you has probably moved on. They are sleeping fine. They are going about their life without the weight of what happened sitting on their chest the way it sits on yours. You know this on some level, and that knowledge tends to make the whole thing worse because the unfairness of it is its own wound on top of the original one. But here is the part that almost nobody stops to examine directly. While they have moved on, you are still in the room where it happened. Every time you return to the grudge, every time you replay what they did and feel the heat of it rise back up through your body, you are experiencing the event as though it is happening again. Your brain does not cleanly distinguish between remembering pain and experiencing it, and that means the psychological and physiological cost of carrying a grudge is not a one-time charge for what was done to you. It is a recurring fee you pay every single time you go back to it, and the person who hurt you is not paying it. Only you are. This is one of those truths that sounds like a platitude until you understand the actual biology underneath it, at which point it stops being comforting advice and starts being a serious account of what sustained resentment does to a body over time. When you ruminate on a past injury, your brain activates the stress response as though the threat is present and current. Cortisol and adrenaline enter the bloodstream. Heart rate and blood pressure climb. The immune system is suppressed. Inflammatory markers increase. The same physiological machinery that was designed to help you survive acute physical danger gets triggered by a memory, a thought, a moment of returning to something that already happened. And because a grudge is not a single event, but a recurring mental habit, this stress response can be triggered dozens or hundreds of times over years, each activation adding to a cumulative physiological load that the body eventually begins to show in measurable ways. Research published in the journal Psychological Science found that people who practiced even a brief act of perspective, taking toward someone who had wronged them, showed immediate reductions in cardiovascular reactivity, meaning their blood pressure and heart rate responses to stress dropped noticeably. A separate body of research from Everett Worthington at Virginia Commonwealth University, who has spent decades studying forgiveness as a psychological and physiological variable rather than a moral or spiritual one, found that people who carried chronic unforgiveness showed consistently elevated markers of inflammation and stress-related illness compared to those who had worked through a process of genuine forgiveness. The grudge was not abstract suffering. It was leaving a measurable biological signature on the people who held it. There is also a cognitive cost that is harder to quantify, but just as real. A grudge occupies mental real estate. The mental bandwidth devoted to maintaining resentment, to rehearsing the narrative of what was done and why it was wrong, and what it says about the person who did it, is bandwidth that is not available for anything else. Creativity, problem solving, presence in current relationships, openness to new experience, all of it gets partially crowded out by the ongoing cognitive labor of tending to the wound. People who carry long-term grudges often describe feeling stuck in ways that seem disconnected from the original grievance, like there is a ceiling on how fully they can engage with the present. And there is. The stuck feeling is real. It is the weight of the mental resources that are tied up in the past rather than available to the present. The hardest part of this truth is that it can feel profoundly unjust. The person who caused the damage should be the one paying the price, not you. Letting go can feel like letting them win, like erasing what happened, like handing them an absolution they do not deserve and have not earned. But that framing confuses forgiveness with exoneration, and they are not the same thing. Forgiveness, in the psychological sense, has nothing to do with the other person. It is not a statement about whether what they did was acceptable. It is not a reconciliation. It is not even something they need to be aware of or involved in. It is a unilateral decision to stop paying the recurring fee, to stop experiencing the event, to take back the mental and physiological resources that have been locked up in the past and return them to the present where they can actually be used. The wound that was inflicted on you was real. The damage was real. None of that is being minimized. But the wound has an end point. The grudge does not, unless you give it one. What was done to you happened once. How many more times you choose to experience it is something that, slowly, and with considerable difficulty, remains within your own power to decide. That is not a comfortable thought. But it is a true one, and it belongs entirely to you in a way that the original injury never did. Free will is mostly a story your brain tells after the fact. Every day, you make thousands of decisions without thinking twice about them. You choose what to eat, what to wear, where to look, who to text, what video to watch, and what opinion to express. It feels obvious that you are the one making those choices. In fact, that feeling is so natural that most people never question it. You experience a thought, make a decision, and take an action. End of story. But what if the story happens in the opposite order? What if many of your decisions are made before you become consciously aware of them? And what if the feeling of being in control is sometimes nothing more than a convincing explanation your brain creates afterward? That idea sounds absurd at first. It feels like an attack on one of the most fundamental assumptions of human existence. After all, if you are not consciously choosing your actions, then who is? Yet some of the most fascinating discoveries in neuroscience point toward an uncomfortable possibility. The conscious mind may have far less control than it likes to believe. The reason this idea is so disturbing is because your entire sense of identity is built around being the author of your decisions. You believe your choices reveal who you are. Your successes, failures, relationships, beliefs, and goals all seem connected to your ability to decide. Without that feeling of authorship, the world starts looking very different. Researchers studying decision-making noticed something strange decades ago. In experiments measuring brain activity, signals associated with an action often appeared before participants reported consciously deciding to act. In simple terms, the brain seemed to be preparing for a decision before the person felt they had made it. The conscious awareness of choosing came later. That finding sparked one of the most controversial debates in psychology and neuroscience. If the brain begins the process before conscious awareness arrives, then what exactly is consciousness doing? One possibility is that consciousness is not the commander we imagine it to be. It may be more like a narrator. Think about how a sports commentator works. The commentator describes what is happening on the field, explains it, and creates a coherent story around it. But the commentator is not controlling the players. The action is already unfolding. Your conscious mind may operate in a surprisingly similar way. Every second, enormous amounts of activity occur beneath your awareness. Memories influence behavior. Emotions shape judgment. Hormones affect motivation. Environmental cues alter decisions. Hidden patterns inside the brain process information long before conscious thought catches up. By the time you become aware of a decision, much of the work may already be done. Then the narrator steps in. It explains the choice. It creates a reason. It tells a story that makes the action feel intentional. And because the explanation arrives almost instantly, it feels like the explanation caused the decision rather than followed it. You can see hints of this process in everyday life. Imagine reaching for a snack while watching television. You might tell yourself you chose it because you were hungry. But were you actually hungry? Or did your brain react to stress, boredom, habit, advertising, or simple availability before creating a logical explanation afterward? Most of the time, people never investigate deeply enough to find out. The explanation feels satisfying, so they accept it. This tendency appears everywhere. Someone develops a strong dislike for another person and later creates a list of reasons to justify it. Someone makes an emotional purchase and then explains why it was a smart financial decision. Someone falls in love and convinces themselves it happened because of specific qualities, even though the initial attraction occurred long before any careful analysis. The brain is remarkably skilled at creating stories that make unconscious processes feel deliberate. That does not mean people are constantly fooling themselves. The explanations are often sincere. The person genuinely believes them. The problem is that sincerity and accuracy are not the same thing. The mind craves coherence. It wants events to make sense. It wants actions to have reasons. It wants life to feel organized rather than chaotic. Whenever a gap appears between what happens and why it happened, the brain rushes to fill that gap with a narrative. In many situations, that narrative is useful. It helps create a stable sense of self. Without it, life might feel confusing and fragmented. Imagine trying to navigate the world without any sense of personal agency or identity. The stories your brain tells are part of what allows you to function. But usefulness does not guarantee truth. The deeper you look into human behavior, the more you notice how many factors operate outside awareness. Childhood experiences shape preferences. Cultural influences shape beliefs. Genetic predispositions influence temperament. Emotional states affect reasoning. Even seemingly trivial factors such as lack of sleep, hunger, weather, or social pressure can change decisions in ways people rarely recognize. Yet after the decision is made, the conscious mind often presents a neat explanation that ignores most of these influences. This is one reason people are so confident about their choices. They mistake the story for the source. The explanation feels complete, so they assume it is complete. What makes this truth especially unsettling is that it challenges the way we think about responsibility, identity, and human nature itself. If much of what drives behavior occurs beneath awareness, then the version of yourself you consciously experience may be only a small part of the system making decisions. The conscious mind likes to imagine it is sitting at the controls, steering the ship wherever it chooses. But a more accurate image might be a passenger standing on the deck, watching countless hidden mechanisms operate below the surface, while telling a story about where the ship is going and why. That does not mean free will is an illusion in the absolute sense. The debate is far more complicated than that. Human beings clearly possess the ability to reflect, learn, adapt, and influence future behavior. But the simple picture most people carry around, the idea that every decision begins with a conscious choice and then leads to action, appears increasingly difficult to defend. The darker possibility is that consciousness often arrives late to the party. The brain has already started moving, already begun calculating, already initiated processes beyond awareness. Then, moments later, The narrator appears and explains what happened as though it had been in charge all along. And because that explanation feels seamless, most people never question it. They continue moving through life believing they are witnessing the origin of every choice, when they may actually be hearing a story constructed after the decision has already begun. The feeling of control is so convincing that it becomes indistinguishable from reality. Yet beneath that feeling, hidden layers of the mind are constantly shaping actions, preferences, and decisions long before consciousness gets the chance to claim ownership. Which means one of the most important voices in your life may not be the one making the decisions at all. It may simply be the one explaining them. The smarter you are, the better you lie to yourself. Most people think intelligence protects them from self-deception. It seems like a reasonable assumption. If someone is highly intelligent, they should be better at spotting flaws in their thinking, more resistant to bad decisions, and less likely to believe things that are not true. We tend to imagine that intelligence functions like a shield against irrationality. The smarter a person becomes, the closer they move toward objective reality. But one of the darkest findings in psychology suggests the opposite can happen. Intelligence does not always make people better at finding the truth. Sometimes it makes them better at defending the lies they already want to believe. That idea feels wrong because we like to think of intelligence as a tool for discovery. In reality, intelligence is also a tool for justification. A sharp mind can analyze evidence, recognize patterns, and solve complex problems. But it can also do something far more dangerous. It can construct incredibly convincing arguments that protect the ego from uncomfortable truths. Think about how most people imagine self-deception. They picture someone uninformed, careless, or lacking critical thinking skills. They imagine a person who simply does not know any better. Yet some of the most impressive acts of self-deception come from people who are exceptionally intelligent, not because they are incapable of understanding reality, but because they are exceptionally skilled at explaining it away. The human mind is not designed primarily to find truth. It is designed to protect survival, maintain identity, and reduce psychological discomfort. Whenever a fact threatens the way you see yourself, your brain experiences tension. Nobody enjoys discovering that they were wrong, hypocritical, insecure, selfish, or responsible for their own problems. Those realizations are painful because they challenge the stories we tell ourselves. This is where intelligence enters the picture. A less intelligent person may struggle to explain away contradictory evidence. A highly intelligent person can generate endless explanations. They can rationalize, reinterpret, and reframe almost anything. They can build arguments so sophisticated that even they start believing them. Imagine someone who secretly fears failure. Instead of admitting that fear, they convince themselves they are simply waiting for the perfect opportunity. Years pass, opportunities come and go, and they continue doing nothing. Because they are intelligent, they can always produce a logical explanation. The timing is wrong. The market is uncertain. The circumstances are not ideal. The plan requires more preparation. Every excuse sounds reasonable. Every explanation appears thoughtful. Yet beneath all the logic is a simple truth they are avoiding. They are afraid. The intelligence is not helping them face reality. It is helping them escape it. You can see this pattern in relationships as well. Someone stays with a partner who makes them miserable. Instead of acknowledging the obvious, they create elaborate reasons for staying. They talk about loyalty, timing, responsibility, complexity, and commitment. Some of those reasons may contain truth, but often they serve another purpose. They protect the person from confronting a more painful reality. Maybe they fear loneliness. Maybe they fear change. Maybe they fear admitting they made the wrong choice. The smarter they are, the more convincing the explanation becomes. Psychologists sometimes refer to this process as rationalization. The mind makes a decision for emotional reasons and then invents logical reasons afterward. What makes intelligence dangerous is that it increases the quality of those justifications. A brilliant mind can create explanations that sound so persuasive they become almost impossible to challenge. This is why intelligence does not automatically lead to wisdom. Wisdom requires something intelligence alone cannot provide: the willingness to question yourself. A person can have an extraordinary ability to analyze the world while remaining completely blind to their own motivations. They can identify flaws in everyone else's thinking while never examining the assumptions driving their own behavior. In fact, intelligence sometimes makes this problem worse because success reinforces confidence. The more often people are right about external matters, the more likely they are to assume they are right about themselves. That confidence creates a dangerous blind spot. When highly intelligent people become attached to a belief, they often defend it more effectively than anyone else. They can cherry-pick evidence, dismiss criticism, and construct detailed arguments supporting their position. To outsiders, they appear rational. To themselves, they appear rational. Yet the reasoning process may be serving an emotional need rather than a search for truth. History is filled with brilliant individuals who justified terrible decisions. Intelligence did not save them. In some cases, it amplified the problem by providing better tools for rationalization. The same thing happens on a smaller scale every day. People convince themselves they are unhappy because of their job when the real issue is fear. They convince themselves they are staying in a relationship out of love when the real reason is comfort. They convince themselves they are pursuing success when they are actually chasing validation. The explanations sound logical because the mind has spent years refining them. The frightening part is that most people never realize they are doing it. Self-deception works precisely because it feels honest. If you knew you were lying to yourself, the lie would lose its power. Instead, the brain hides the process. It presents the explanation as reality. The smarter the person, the more sophisticated that explanation can become. This creates an uncomfortable possibility. Some of the beliefs you feel most certain about may not be true because they survived scrutiny. They may feel true because your mind became exceptionally skilled at protecting them. That is why genuine self-awareness is so rare. It requires more than intelligence. It requires humility. It requires the ability to sit with uncomfortable truths without immediately explaining them away. It requires recognizing that your mind is not just a tool for understanding reality. It is also a tool for defending your identity. And identities fight hard to survive. The darkest part of this psychological truth is that intelligence often gives people exactly what they need to avoid confronting themselves. The sharper the mind, the easier it becomes to build elaborate stories, sophisticated justifications, and convincing narratives that keep painful truths at a distance. While less intelligent people may struggle to maintain certain illusions, highly intelligent people can spend years constructing entire mental worlds designed to protect them from reality. That is why being smart does not guarantee honesty with yourself. In fact, it can create the opposite problem. Because once your mind becomes powerful enough to explain away almost anything, the hardest person to fool is no longer other people. It is yourself. People endure suffering far longer than they choose change. One of the strangest things about human beings is that they can recognize a problem, complain about it every day, know exactly how much damage it is causing, and still do absolutely nothing to change it. From the outside, this behavior looks irrational. If something is making you miserable, why not leave? If a situation is hurting you, why not walk away? If a habit is destroying your life, why not stop? The answer reveals something deeply uncomfortable about human nature. Most people do not fear suffering nearly as much as they fear uncertainty. We like to imagine that human beings are driven by the pursuit of happiness, but much of the time we are driven by the pursuit of familiarity. And familiarity has a strange power over the mind. Even when a situation is painful, stressful, or emotionally draining, the fact that it is known makes it feel safer than the unknown alternative. This is why people stay in jobs they hate for years. Every morning feels exhausting. Every week feels repetitive. Every month confirms they are unhappy. Yet they remain, not because they enjoy the experience, but because they understand it. They know what tomorrow will look like. They know what to expect. The misery becomes predictable, and predictable pain often feels less frightening than uncertain possibility. The same pattern appears in relationships. Sometimes people stay with partners who make them unhappy, not because they believe the relationship is healthy, but because leaving would force them into unfamiliar territory. Loneliness feels uncertain. Starting over feels uncertain. Rebuilding life feels uncertain. As painful as the current situation may be, it feels safer than stepping into a future they cannot control. What makes this truth so dark is that suffering has a remarkable ability to become normal. Human beings adapt to almost everything. A situation that once felt unbearable slowly becomes part of everyday life. The stress remains. The frustration remains. The disappointment remains. But over time, the mind adjusts. What was once shocking becomes routine. What was once unacceptable becomes expected. And once suffering becomes familiar, people stop seeing it clearly. They stop asking whether things could be different. They stop questioning whether they deserve better. They stop imagining alternatives. Instead, they begin organizing their lives around surviving the discomfort rather than escaping it. Psychologists have observed this pattern in countless areas of human behavior. People often require significantly more pain to motivate change than logic alone would suggest. Knowing that a situation is harmful is rarely enough. Understanding the consequences is rarely enough. Even recognizing exactly what needs to change is often not enough. The suffering must reach a point where it finally becomes more frightening than the uncertainty waiting on the other side. Until then, many people stay exactly where they are. Think about how often someone says they want to change their life. They want to get healthier, leave a toxic environment, pursue a dream, end a destructive habit, or start over. Yet years pass and nothing happens. The desire was real. The awareness was real. But awareness and action are not the same thing. The mind constantly performs a calculation beneath consciousness. It compares two forms of discomfort: the discomfort of staying where you are and the discomfort of stepping into the unknown. As long as the current pain feels more manageable than the uncertainty of change, most people remain stuck. This is why major transformations often happen after a crisis. A relationship finally collapses. A health scare forces action. A career reaches a breaking point. A person hits an emotional wall they can no longer ignore. From the outside, it may look like sudden courage. In reality, the equation changed. The pain of staying finally became greater than the fear of leaving. The tragedy is that many people wait far longer than necessary. They spend years enduring situations that slowly erode their happiness because the suffering arrives gradually. There is no dramatic moment, no clear warning sign, just a steady accumulation of frustration, disappointment, and regret. Each individual day feels tolerable, but the years tell a different story. What makes this even more dangerous is that the mind becomes skilled at rationalizing the decision to stay. People tell themselves they are waiting for the right moment. They convince themselves conditions will improve. They focus on rare positive experiences while ignoring the overall pattern. The brain creates explanations that make inaction feel reasonable. Sometimes those explanations sound incredibly convincing. A person remains in a failing relationship because they believe things will eventually get better. An employee stays in a miserable job because they think quitting would be irresponsible. Someone avoids pursuing a dream because they insist they need more preparation. On the surface, these explanations appear logical, but beneath them often lies a simpler truth. They are afraid, not necessarily of failure, not necessarily of pain. They are afraid of uncertainty. Human beings have an extraordinary capacity to tolerate suffering when they know what to expect. What they struggle with is uncertainty. The unknown forces them to confront possibilities they cannot predict, outcomes they cannot control, and futures they cannot fully imagine. That uncertainty triggers anxiety, and anxiety frequently feels more urgent than unhappiness. As a result, people choose familiar suffering over unfamiliar freedom. They choose predictable disappointment over uncertain opportunity. They choose comfortable misery over uncomfortable growth. And they do it so often that the pattern begins to feel normal. The darkest part of this psychological truth is that many people never realize how much of their life is being shaped by avoidance. They believe they are making rational decisions when they are actually protecting themselves from uncertainty. They tell themselves they are being practical, patient, or realistic. Meanwhile, years continue passing. Then one day they look back and discover that the thing they feared most was never the change itself. It was the possibility of change. The future they spent years avoiding may not have been perfect. It may have contained challenges, failures, and setbacks. But it also contained possibilities that never had the chance to exist because fear kept them standing still. That is why people endure suffering far longer than they choose change, not because suffering feels good, not because they enjoy pain, but because the known, no matter how painful, often feels safer than the unknown. And until that balance shifts, many people will continue carrying burdens they desperately want to put down, simply because they are terrified of what life might look like without them. 4 seconds of eye contact ends in desire or aggression. Nothing else. There is a moment that almost everyone has experienced, but very few people think about. You are walking through a crowd, sitting across a room, standing in an elevator, or waiting in line somewhere, and suddenly your eyes meet someone else's. At first it feels ordinary, just a glance. But then neither of you looks away. 1 second passes. Then another. And another. Something begins to change. The atmosphere shifts. The interaction becomes heavier. The silence starts feeling louder. And without a single word being spoken, your brain begins asking a question that has followed human beings for thousands of years. What does this mean? Most eye contact lasts only a fraction of a second. We look, gather information, and move on. It happens so quickly that we barely notice it. But prolonged eye contact is different. The longer it continues, the harder it becomes for the mind to treat it as neutral. The brain starts searching for an explanation because sustained attention from another human being is rarely meaningless. This is where things get interesting. Human beings are incredibly sensitive to eyes. Long before language became sophisticated, our ancestors relied on facial expressions, gaze direction, and visual signals to understand intentions. Survival often depended on quickly determining whether another person represented a threat, an ally, a competitor, or a potential mate. As a result, the human brain became highly attuned to eye contact in ways most people never consciously realize. When someone holds your gaze longer than expected, your nervous system immediately becomes alert, not necessarily because danger is present, but because attention is. And attention has always mattered. Think about how uncomfortable prolonged eye contact can feel with a stranger. There is no physical contact, no conversation, no obvious action taking place. Yet after a few seconds, many people feel compelled to look away. They laugh nervously, check their phone, glance at the floor, or pretend they noticed something else nearby. Why? Because sustained eye contact creates psychological intensity. It forces two minds into a kind of silent confrontation where both people become aware of each other's awareness. Suddenly, you are not just observing another person. You are being observed by them at the same time. That experience is surprisingly powerful. Researchers studying social behavior have found that prolonged eye contact can increase emotional arousal. Heart rates may rise. Self-consciousness increases. People become more aware of themselves and the person in front of them. The interaction begins feeling significant even when nothing has actually happened. This is where two common interpretations often emerge. The first is attraction. When eye contact occurs between people who already find each other appealing, the effect can be remarkably strong. Looking into someone's eyes for an extended period creates a sense of connection that goes beyond words. It feels intimate because attention itself is intimate. In a world where everyone is distracted, focused attention becomes emotionally meaningful. That is why eye contact plays such an important role in romantic attraction. Before conversations become deep, before relationships develop, and before trust is established, there is often a period where two people simply look at each other longer than necessary. The gaze communicates interest before language does, but attraction is only one possible interpretation. The second is challenge. Throughout history, prolonged eye contact has also been associated with dominance, competition, and aggression. In both humans and animals, staring can function as a signal of status. Looking away often communicates submission or disengagement, while holding a gaze can communicate confidence, defiance, or confrontation. This is why staring contests feel strangely intense. It is why arguments often involve prolonged eye contact. It is why two strangers can create tension without saying a single word. The eyes become a battlefield. Neither person wants to retreat first. Neither person wants to appear intimidated. What makes this psychological truth so fascinating is that the physical behavior remains almost identical in both situations. Two people are simply looking at each other, yet the emotional meaning can be completely different. The brain knows this. And because it knows this, it struggles to interpret prolonged eye contact as neutral. When a stranger holds your gaze for several seconds, your mind instinctively starts evaluating possibilities. Are they attracted to me? Are they judging me? Do they recognize me? Are they challenging me? Do they want something? The uncertainty creates tension because the brain hates unanswered social questions. That tension explains why prolonged eye contact feels so different from ordinary observation. A quick glance provides information. A sustained gaze demands interpretation. The darker part of this truth is that people often reveal more through their eyes than they intend to. Most social behaviors are carefully managed. People control their words, adjust their tone, and filter their actions. Eye contact is harder to manage. It exists closer to instinct than performance. A person may hide attraction verbally while their eyes remain fixed on someone across the room. Another person may claim they are calm while maintaining an intense stare that communicates hostility. The conscious mind edits many signals. The eyes often expose them. Of course, human behavior is never as simple as a single rule. Not every 4-second gaze ends in desire or aggression. Sometimes curiosity, confusion, recognition, or simple distraction play a role. But what makes prolonged eye contact so psychologically powerful is that the brain rarely treats it as meaningless. The longer the gaze lasts, the more urgently the mind searches for emotional significance. And that search reveals something profound about human nature. We are constantly trying to understand one another, searching for intentions, searching for motives, searching for signs of connection or threat. Sometimes that search happens through conversations, actions, and relationships. But sometimes it happens in complete silence, through nothing more than two pairs of eyes refusing to look away. Because after a few seconds, eye contact stops feeling like observation and starts feeling like communication. And once that happens, the brain can no longer treat the moment as ordinary. It becomes charged with possibility, tension, and meaning. Whether that meaning becomes desire, aggression, or something in between, one thing is almost certain. Neither person experiences it as just a look anymore. You silently absorb everyone's emotional state around you. Most people believe their emotions belong entirely to them. If they wake up feeling anxious, they assume the anxiety came from their own thoughts. If they feel irritated, sad, excited, or optimistic, they naturally assume those emotions originated somewhere inside their own mind. It feels obvious. After all, who else could be responsible for what you are feeling? But what if many of your emotions never started with you at all? What if a surprising amount of your emotional life is being shaped by the people around you, often without either of you realizing it? Human beings like to think of themselves as independent individuals moving through the world with their own thoughts and feelings. In reality, we are far more connected than we appear. Every day, your brain is constantly reading facial expressions, body language, tone of voice, posture, energy levels, and countless other social signals. Most of this happens beneath conscious awareness. You are not actively analyzing every person you encounter. Yet your nervous system is collecting information the entire time. And that information affects you. Imagine walking into a room where everyone has just received terrible news. Nobody says a word to you. Nobody explains what happened. Yet within seconds, you can often sense that something is wrong. The atmosphere feels different. Conversations are quieter. Faces look tense. Movements seem heavier. Even before you understand the situation, your emotional state begins responding to it. The same thing happens in reverse. Walk into a room filled with excitement, laughter, and genuine enthusiasm, and you may find your mood improving before you even know why. The emotional climate around you starts influencing your own internal experience. This phenomenon is sometimes called emotional contagion, and it reveals something fascinating about human psychology. Emotions spread between people in ways that are remarkably similar to infections, not through germs or viruses, but through observation, imitation, and unconscious social synchronization. The reason this happens is deeply rooted in human evolution. For most of history, survival depended on staying connected to the emotional states of the people around you. If everyone in your group suddenly became frightened, paying attention to that fear could save your life. If everyone became calm, cooperative, or alert, adapting to those states improved your chances of survival. Human beings evolved as social creatures, and part of that evolution involved becoming incredibly sensitive to the emotional signals of others. The problem is that this sensitivity never disappeared. It still operates every day. You may think you are simply having a bad mood, when in reality you are carrying emotional residue from the people around you. A stressed coworker, an anxious friend, a frustrated partner, or even a stranger's visible anger can quietly influence your emotional state. Because the process happens automatically, most people never notice the transfer taking place. What makes this truth especially unsettling is how quickly it can happen. Research has shown that people unconsciously mimic the facial expressions of others, often within fractions of a second. When someone smiles, tiny muscles in your own face may subtly respond. When someone appears distressed, your body can begin mirroring aspects of that distress. These reactions are so small and automatic that you rarely become aware of them. Yet they help transmit emotions from one person to another. In other words, your brain is constantly practicing empathy even when you are not trying to. Think about spending time with someone who is relentlessly negative. At first, you may feel unaffected. You tell yourself their attitude is their problem, not yours. But after enough exposure, something begins to shift. Complaints start sounding more reasonable. Cynicism starts feeling more natural. Small frustrations seem larger than they did before. Eventually, you may find yourself carrying emotions that were not originally yours. The same principle explains why certain people leave you feeling energized while others leave you emotionally drained. It is not always about what they say. Sometimes it is about what their emotional state is silently communicating. Human beings are constantly exchanging information at levels deeper than conversation. This is one reason moods can spread through entire groups. A single person's anxiety can influence a family. A leader's confidence can influence a team. A friend's enthusiasm can transform an evening. Emotions rarely stay contained within the person experiencing them. They ripple outward, affecting everyone nearby. The darker side of this truth is that many people spend years surrounded by emotional environments that slowly reshape them. They absorb stress without realizing it. They absorb fear without questioning it. They absorb bitterness, insecurity, pessimism, and anger until those emotions begin feeling like part of their own personality. And because the process is gradual, they rarely notice where the feelings came from. They simply assume that this is who they are. But if you could somehow trace every emotion back to its source, you might discover that many of the feelings you carry were picked up along the way. Not intentionally, not consciously, but through countless interactions with other human beings. This realization changes the way you look at relationships. It forces you to recognize that the people around you influence more than your habits, beliefs, and decisions. They influence your emotional landscape. Every person you spend time with becomes part of the environment your nervous system learns from. That does not mean you should avoid anyone experiencing pain or struggle. Human connection requires compassion. Everyone needs support during difficult periods. But it does mean becoming aware of how profoundly emotional states can spread. The company you keep affects far more than your schedule. It affects how you feel, how you think, and how you experience the world. The most unsettling part is that this process never really stops. Even when you are silent, even when nobody is speaking, emotional information is constantly flowing between people. Your brain is reading signals, adjusting responses, and absorbing pieces of the emotional atmosphere around you, which means your emotional life is not as private or independent as it seems. Every day, without realizing it, you are carrying fragments of other people's fears, hopes, stress, excitement, confidence, and despair. Their emotions brush against yours, leaving traces behind. Some disappear quickly, others linger for years. And by the time you call those feelings your own, you may have completely forgotten where they came from in the first place. Morality drops when you're tired, hungry, or cold. Most people like to believe their moral values are solid. They see honesty, kindness, fairness, and self-control as permanent parts of who they are. In their minds, character is something stable. A good person remains a good person regardless of the circumstances. A moral decision is simply a matter of choosing right over wrong. It sounds comforting because it suggests that our values are deeply rooted and resistant to outside influence. But one of the most unsettling discoveries in psychology is that morality may be far more fragile than we want to admit. Many of the ethical decisions people take pride in are not made in ideal conditions. They are made by biological organisms running on limited energy, fluctuating emotions, physical discomfort, and exhausted mental resources. And when those resources begin to run low, something surprising happens. The standards people assume are permanent often become much easier to compromise. Think about how different you feel after a full night of sleep compared to how you feel after being awake for 20 hours. The patient version of you and the exhausted version of you are not exactly the same person. The tired version becomes more irritable, more impulsive, less tolerant, and often less capable of thinking through long-term consequences. The values may still exist, but your ability to act on them starts weakening. The same thing happens with hunger. Almost everyone has experienced becoming noticeably more impatient when they have not eaten for hours. Small problems feel larger. Minor frustrations become harder to ignore. Emotional reactions intensify. There is a reason people joke about becoming a completely different person when they are hungry. Beneath the humor lies a real psychological effect. When the brain lacks resources, self-control becomes more difficult. What makes this so disturbing is that morality often depends on self-control. Being honest can require resisting temptation. Being kind can require suppressing irritation. Being fair can require overcoming selfish impulses. Being patient can require emotional regulation. All of those processes consume mental energy. When that energy is depleted, people become more vulnerable to choices they normally would not make. Researchers studying decision-making have repeatedly found that factors people assume are irrelevant can influence judgment in surprising ways. Judges, for example, have shown different patterns of decision-making depending on factors such as fatigue and breaks during the day. People evaluating moral situations often become harsher, less thoughtful, or more emotionally reactive when their physical condition deteriorates. The uncomfortable implication is that morality is not operating independently from biology. It is operating through biology. Imagine two versions of the same person. In one scenario, they are rested, comfortable, emotionally stable, and physically satisfied. In another, they are exhausted, hungry, stressed, and freezing cold. Most people assume both versions would make identical ethical decisions because their values remain the same. Reality is often messier. The tired version may snap at someone they care about. The hungry version may become selfish. The stressed version may justify behavior they would normally criticize. The cold and uncomfortable version may care less about other people's needs because their attention is consumed by their own discomfort. None of these changes necessarily transform someone into a bad person, but they reveal how much moral behavior depends on mental resources people rarely think about. This is one reason survival situations are so psychologically fascinating. When resources become scarce and physical discomfort becomes extreme, behavior often changes dramatically. People who consider themselves generous may become protective. People who consider themselves calm may become aggressive. People who believe they would always do the right thing suddenly discover that the definition of right becomes more complicated when their body feels threatened. The reason is simple. Your brain evolved to keep you alive first. Everything else comes afterward. When physical needs become intense enough, the survival system begins taking priority over abstract ideals. Hunger, exhaustion, and discomfort narrow attention. The mind becomes focused on immediate relief. Long-term principles start competing with short-term biological demands. That does not mean morality disappears. It means morality becomes harder. And that distinction matters. Most people judge character based on actions without considering the conditions under which those actions occurred. They assume a moral failure reveals something permanent about a person. Sometimes it does, but sometimes it reveals something about the state they were in when the decision was made. Think about how many conflicts begin when people are physically depleted. Arguments late at night tend to escalate faster. Frustrations become larger when someone is hungry. Small inconveniences feel overwhelming when exhaustion has drained emotional reserves. In those moments, people often say things they regret, make decisions they would not normally make, and behave in ways that surprise even themselves. The frightening part is how unaware people are of this influence. Most do not think, I am making this decision because I am exhausted. They think, this is what I genuinely want to do. The biological influence stays hidden, while the mind creates logical explanations afterward. That is what makes this truth so dark. We imagine morality as a purely philosophical issue, something rooted entirely in beliefs and principles. Yet beneath those principles sits a physical body constantly influencing perception, judgment, patience, empathy, and self-control. The person who prides themselves on compassion may find compassion harder when they are depleted. The person who values honesty may struggle more when they are desperate. The person who believes they would always make the ethical choice may discover that ethical choices feel different when survival instincts enter the equation. This does not mean morality is an illusion. It means morality is more fragile than people like to admit. Character is not tested when everything is comfortable and easy. It is tested when resources are low, emotions are strained, and the body is demanding relief. The darkest realization is that many of the values people consider permanent may actually depend on conditions they take for granted. The ability to be patient, generous, fair, and self-controlled is often supported by something far less noble than philosophy. Sometimes it is supported by a good night's sleep, sometimes by a warm room, sometimes by a full stomach. And when those foundations disappear, people often discover that the distance between who they think they are and what they are capable of doing is much smaller than they ever imagined. Wanting something feels better than actually getting it. Most people spend their lives chasing things they believe will finally make them happy. A better job, more money, the perfect relationship, a dream house, recognition, success. They imagine a future moment when everything they have been working toward finally arrives, and they picture themselves feeling complete. The fantasy is vivid. It keeps them motivated. It gives them direction. It convinces them that satisfaction is waiting just a little farther ahead. But then something strange happens. They get the thing they wanted, and the feeling never lasts. For a few days, maybe a few weeks, there is excitement. There is relief. There is a rush of emotion that feels exactly like what they expected, but eventually the intensity fades. The new reality becomes normal. The thing that once consumed their thoughts becomes just another part of everyday life. And before long, their attention shifts toward the next goal. Most people assume this happens because they are chasing the wrong things. Sometimes that is true. But often something much deeper is happening. The human brain is not designed to reward possession as much as it rewards pursuit. In other words, wanting something often feels better than actually having it. At first, that sounds absurd. How could the desire for something be more pleasurable than finally getting it? Yet neuroscience has revealed that anticipation and reward are not the same experience. The systems involved in craving are often more active before the reward arrives than after it has been obtained. Think about how much excitement builds before a vacation. For weeks, sometimes months, your mind imagines what it will be like. You picture the destinations, the experiences, and the freedom waiting ahead. The anticipation becomes part of the pleasure. Then the vacation arrives. You enjoy it, but eventually it ends. What often lasts longest is not the experience itself, but the period of looking forward to it. The same thing happens with purchases. You spend days researching a product, watching comparing options, imagining how much better life will be once you own it. The anticipation creates excitement. Then you finally buy it. For a brief moment, it feels amazing, but a few weeks later, it has become ordinary. The thrill was not in ownership. The thrill was in expectation. This pattern appears everywhere because the brain treats possibility differently than reality. Possibility is perfect. Reality never is. When something exists only in your imagination, it remains untouched by flaws. The dream job contains no frustrating coworkers. The dream relationship contains no disagreements. The dream achievement contains no unexpected problems. The future version of happiness exists in a carefully edited form. Reality cannot compete with that. The moment you obtain something, it stops being a fantasy and starts becoming real. Real things come with limitations. Real relationships involve challenges. Real achievements require maintenance. Real success introduces new problems alongside new rewards. As a result, the brain often experiences a subtle disappointment, not because the goal was bad, but because reality rarely matches the perfection of anticipation. What makes this psychological truth so powerful is that it fuels much of human behavior. Entire industries are built around anticipation. Advertisements do not sell products as much as they sell future feelings. Social media does not sell experiences as much as it sells the promise of experiences. Marketing thrives on desire because desire is emotionally intense. The anticipation of a reward can be more motivating than the reward itself. Researchers studying dopamine discovered something fascinating. Many people think dopamine is the chemical of pleasure. In reality, it is more closely connected to motivation, pursuit, and expectation. It drives you toward rewards. It pushes you to seek. It creates excitement around what might happen next. That means the strongest neurological activity often occurs before the reward arrives. The chase becomes more stimulating than the capture. This helps explain why some people become trapped in endless cycles of pursuit. They are constantly setting new goals, chasing new relationships, seeking new experiences, and acquiring new possessions. Each new target creates excitement. Each achievement delivers a temporary high. Then the feeling fades, and another goal takes its place. From the outside, it looks like ambition. Sometimes it is. But sometimes it is addiction to anticipation. The person is not actually chasing the reward anymore. They are chasing the feeling of wanting the reward. You can even see this in relationships. Some people become obsessed during the early stages of attraction. Every text message creates excitement. Every interaction feels meaningful. Every possibility feels thrilling. Then, once the relationship becomes stable and predictable, the intensity decreases. They mistake the loss of anticipation for the loss of love. In reality, they may be missing the emotional rush of uncertainty. The wanting felt stronger than the having. The darker side of this truth is that it can keep people trapped in the future. They become convinced that happiness exists somewhere ahead of them. Once they get the promotion, then they will be satisfied. Once they earn more money, then they will relax. Once they find the perfect partner, then everything will feel complete. But the mind keeps moving the finish line. The future becomes a permanent destination that never arrives. Every achievement briefly satisfies before transforming into a new starting point. Every success creates another desire. Every goal opens the door to another goal. And because anticipation is so emotionally rewarding, the cycle can continue indefinitely. This does not mean goals are meaningless. Ambition matters. Growth matters. Achievement matters. The problem begins when people expect arrival to feel as good as anticipation. Because arrival is different. Arrival is quieter, less dramatic, less emotionally intense, and far more temporary than people imagine. The most unsettling part of this psychological truth is realizing how much of your life may be driven by feelings attached to the future. The excitement, motivation, and hope that push you forward often come not from having what you want, but from imagining what it would be like to have it. And once you finally get there, your brain quickly adapts. The extraordinary becomes ordinary. The dream becomes reality. The reward becomes familiar. Then the cycle begins again. A new goal appears. A new fantasy forms. A new future starts calling your attention. And once again, the wanting begins to feel better than the having. Because the human mind is often less interested in possessing happiness than it is in chasing it.